On a gray, sunless morning, across a patch of withered, brittle grass, a weary, starving figure slowly lifted its head. This wasn't just any stray dog. This was Kairos, a four-legged warrior once lost in the fire of war. And when those faded eyes met the man who had once fought beside him, memory, pain, and an unspoken promise came flooding back. No one had called his name, yet he returned, for one reason only. But what kept Kairos alive through all those forgotten years? A late March afternoon draped a silver-gray hue over every surface of Veldenmoor Park. The bare branches intertwined like the fingers of an old hand, brushing lightly against the sky, heavy with mist. There was no wind to speak of, only a quiet draft weaving through the last stubborn leaves, nudging Thorn Alistair's dark hair slightly to one side. He sat alone on a stone bench, a paper cup of coffee resting by his foot, his calloused hands clasped before him as if holding something fragile between them. Thorn didn't frequent this park, not unless something unsettled stirred inside him. On days when the gunfire in his mind felt too real, when the faces from the past returned to whisper his name in voices that no longer belonged to this world. But today, instead of fleeing those memories, he had walked into Veldenmoor with a strange sense of direction, as if drawn by something shapeless, unnamed, yet certain. Somehow he felt that if he followed the stone path all the way to the end, he'd understand why he was meant to be there. The early light never broke through the blanket of clouds. On a patch of dry, yellowed grass, withered from a long winter, something moved. A quiet figure, head bowed, nibbling at the ground. Not a squirrel, not a bird, a dog. It was large, coated in gray-black fur matted with dust. Its ribs and shoulder blades jutted out stark beneath the skin. Thorn stood. He didn't move quickly, but his eyes had already locked onto the figure, and everything around him faded. For a moment, there was only this shape in the distance. The dog lifted its head. It lasted just a second, a blink, nothing more, but in that moment, Thorn saw everything. That gaze wasn't from a stray, but a soldier. One who had known commands, life or death decisions, and the weight of sacrifice. Time had dulled the sharp gold of its eyes, and dirt had buried the glint of steel in its stare. But he knew. He knew. His lips parted, voice low and cracked like wind scraping through a canyon. Kairos. The dog didn't bark. It didn't charge forward. It simply stood still, its gaze unwavering, as if trying to reach into something deeper than memory. Then, slow as an old film reel, the tail gave a faint flick, the ears dipped back, and one paw lifted in the quiet beginning of a step. Thorn dropped to his knees. His legs met the cold grass, but his hands didn't reach forward, not yet. They hovered near his chest, as though carrying an apology he couldn't speak. Kairos stood before him, breath short and labored, the small scar behind his ear still visible. A scar from a rainy night in Khosra, when shrapnel tore through the air during what would become their last mission together. Kairos, Thorn whispered again, and this time his hand reached out, resting gently on the space between the dog's eyes, a gesture only those who had shared life and death could truly understand. Behind them, the metallic clink of a chain echoed. An older man with long, matted hair tied at the nape of his neck approached, wearing a faded military jacket and holding a tangled leash. "Hey, Ash, what did you find there?" the man called out, but stopped abruptly at the sight of Thorn kneeling. Ash. Thorn looked up, his voice quiet but firm. "You call him Ash?" "Yeah, no tags. No name. I just picked something." He didn't seem to mind. The man set down a plastic bag and pulled out a few pieces of hardened bread. Kairos, Ash, didn't look away. He kept his eyes on Thorn, as if afraid that turning his head would break the illusion, and all this would vanish like a dream. "I'm sorry," Thorn said, rising slowly and brushing his hand along his jeans. "His real name is Kairos. We served together, in the military." The old man's brow furrowed. His voice lowered. "Military, huh? So that's why he flinches every time he hears a siren?" Thorn nodded. "Maybe." The two men, one aging, one worn by years of silence, stood in quiet understanding while the wind rustled around them, and a dog became the bridge between lives that otherwise would never have crossed. Thorn spoke, not just words, but memories, about that final mission in Khosra, about the night Kairos was wounded and disappeared after the unit pulled out. For 2 years after being discharged, Thorn searched. Dozens of adoption requests, messages sent into silence, walls of bureaucracy that never responded. "I thought he was dead." "No," the old man said gently. "He was just looking for someone who hadn't given up on him." Those words, spoken by the man Thorn would later come to know as Marvin, settled into the space between them like a truth long buried. Kairos hadn't chosen to die. He had chosen to endure. Even with a weakened body, even when no one called his name, he had kept going, step by step, until fate brought him here. Thorn sat again. Kairos lay down beside him, resting his head on Thorn's leg the way he used to. No orders, no missions, no promises of food or shelter. And still, the dog had returned to the one person who had once meant everything to him. In the hush of Veldenmoor Park, Thorn realized something with aching clarity. Kairos hadn't come back out of instinct. He had returned because of a vow never to abandon the ones he loved. And vows like that never lose their meaning. As the sun leaned westward, casting a soft golden line across the bare trees of Veldenmoor, Marvin and Thorn sat across from one another on worn stone benches. Between them lay Kairos, his head now resting on Marvin's leg, eyes half closed, breathing out the remnants of a day too long. Marvin broke a piece of dry bread from a paper bag, his fingers trembling slightly, but his movements were precise. He didn't look at Kairos, yet the dog lifted its head at just the right moment, gently taking the piece in that cautious, familiar way, as if they had rehearsed this silent duet hundreds of times before, without words, without cues. Thorn watched them, a strange ache loosening and warming his chest all at once, like witnessing something heartbreakingly simple. A man and a dog, no shared language, no shared history, yet somehow surviving together, without needing any complex reason. "How long has he been with you?" Thorn asked, his voice low, carrying something unnamed, something like gratitude, and perhaps a trace of quiet envy only a human heart could know. 8 months, almost to the day, Marvin replied, his eyes still gazing upward toward a sky where birds traced a quiet arc. "I didn't find him. He found me." The words lingered between them for a long while. Neither said anything more. The wind whispered through the brittle grass. Kairos licked his lips, then tucked his head closer to Marvin's leg, the way a child might lean into a father's shoulder when no words are needed to feel safe. Marvin leaned back against the tree trunk, exhaled deeply, and began to speak. His voice held no sharpness, no sorrow, just the tone of a man who had rewound the memory so many times it had worn down to a bare, unvarnished truth. "It was the first week of July, sun hot enough to burn your shoulders. I was crawling around under the East Bridge Viaduct, hoping to find a few aluminum cans to trade for a bottle of water. That's when I heard it. A sound, not loud, but something about it made me stand up. When I saw him, he was eating paper, a piece of cardboard someone had thrown away. He chewed slowly, bit by bit, not like he was starving, more like he no longer believed anything he found would truly fill him." Thorn didn't interrupt. His eyes were fixed on Marvin's hand, absently stroking behind Kairos's ear, right where the scar lay. That kind of gesture wasn't taught. It couldn't be imitated. Only those who had witnessed pain firsthand knew how to touch a wound without making it worse. I didn't call out. I just sat down, cracked open the last tin of sardines I had, and left it there on the ground. He smelled it, but didn't rush in. Took 10 minutes for him to approach, eyes looking at me like he was asking, "Is this real?" "And then?" Thorn asked softly. "And then I told him, 'Go on, eat. I've got no one else to share it with anyway.'" Marvin chuckled. Not a laugh of joy, the kind of sound people make when they've lost enough to turn even laughter into muscle memory. After that, he followed me. Didn't bark, didn't claw or growl, just walked behind me, like he was afraid that walking beside me would get him pushed away. Kairos had drifted off to sleep. Thorn looked at him and noticed how the tangled fur showed signs of once being brushed, remnants of Marvin's efforts to dig through dumpsters for an old plastic comb. He noticed, too, the strips of denim wrapped around Kairos's paws, torn from the jacket Marvin now wore. These were the kinds of details that didn't need explaining. They spoke louder than any words. "Did you know he used to be military?" Thorn asked. Marvin nodded. "Yeah, I saw it in his eyes. The eyes of someone who's seen things others only read about in the news." "Then why didn't you turn him in? To a rescue group or the police?" Marvin turned and looked at Thorn for a long time. Not with anger, just the look of a man who had lived too long on the margins of trust. "Do you know how people look at me when I ask for medicine for him? They don't look at me, they look through me, like I'm not even there. And if I don't exist, then neither does he. At least not in a way they believe deserves to be cared for." Thorn lowered his head. The sky had deepened to a bronze hue, the sunlight gone, leaving only the sound of distant birds calling each other home. "You didn't have to do all this," Thorn said after a long pause. "I know what he used to be. I'm one of the ones he saved, and I know I can't just take him back. I can't claim something I once let go." Marvin smiled for the first time. A tired smile, but kind. "You didn't lose him. He's still himself. Whether his name's Kairos or Ash, whether he came from Kasra or crawled out from under Eastbridge, he's still him, because he never forgot how to stay loyal." That sentence closed the day like a song that never needed a chorus. Marvin stood and gave Kairos a gentle pat on the head. The dog stirred, then slowly rose to his feet. He didn't follow one or the other. He walked in between them, just as he had learned from both, from a battlefield of bullets and from a street lined with shadows. The streetlights had begun to glow, casting a soft gold shimmer on Kairos's pointed ears. And in that moment, Thorn understood. He was no longer the handler, and Marvin was no longer just a man who offered shelter. They were simply fellow travelers, lucky enough to walk a part of their journey alongside a soul who once made a vow and never forgot how to keep it. Night fell over Veldenmoor Park like a heavy velvet curtain, softening the sharp edges of the world. Beneath the pale yellow glow of the only working lamppost, 3 shadows stretched long across the damp grass. 2 men, 1 dog, and a shared fragment of life extended for a few quiet hours by the kind of silence that doesn't need to be explained. Kairos lay beside Thorn. But it wasn't the posture of an old, worn-out dog retreating into rest. There was something different now, something quiet but unmistakable, like a body trained to conceal pain, but a heart still willing to open when it recognizes someone who matters. Thorn placed his hand gently on Kairos's back and gave a soft pat. What met his hand wasn't the smooth, sleek fur of years ago, but a thin layer of skin stretched over a rough, bony frame. Still, he didn't pull away. His hand moved slowly until it paused over one familiar place, the scar on the left hip. The wound was still there, faded but unmistakable. A raised crescent of skin, darker than the fur around it, curved gently like a bow. Thorn closed his eyes, and in a flash, it all came roaring back. Smoke, gunpowder, voices screaming over the radio, a blinding explosion. The memory hit him like waves crashing through a broken dam. That day was the third of Operation Sweep on the Kasra Plateau, near the Syrian border. Thorn's unit had been deployed overnight, ordered to sweep through a mountainous region believed to house rebel strongholds. Kairos had only been 3 years old, but already a legend, not for his record, but for his eyes. Kairos never barked to alert like other K9s. He just stood still, ears perked, gaze locked on a spot, and the team knew there was something there they shouldn't cross. The air was thick with mist that day. Every step on the gravel rang like a warning across the canyon. Thorn led the line. Kairos walked offset to the left, like always. They had just cleared the fourth bend when a tiny click broke the silence, soft, like a fingernail snapping. Thorn froze. His foot had just touched a landmine buried in the dry earth. Time stalled for 3 seconds. Then Kairos let out a deep, guttural growl, not a bark, but something primal, as if instinct itself had cried out. In a single motion, he lunged forward, threw his full weight into Thorn, shoving him aside. The explosion followed, shaking the earth with a furious roar. Thorn hit the ground hard. His head spun. His ears rang like struck bells. When he lifted himself up, the space where he had stood moments ago was soaked in blood. Kairos lay motionless, his left hip torn open, chest rising in erratic bursts like a flame about to die. Thorn rushed over, ripped off his shirt, and pressed it against the wound. There was no time to call for help. He remembered yelling something, screaming Kairos's name like he'd never screamed before. And Kairos, in his final glance of that day, blinked slowly, like he was asking, "Did I do right?" After that, Kairos vanished from the camp. Thorn heard he'd been medevaced out by helicopter, but no follow-up report ever surfaced. His name disappeared from all tracking systems. The last entry in the unit's logs read, KIA, presumed fatal. Thorn opened his eyes. A breeze stirred the air. He wasn't in Kasra anymore. He was in Veldenmoor, on a cold spring night beside an old friend, not in memory, but in flesh, breathing, real, and still carrying that scar. Kairos raised his head and nuzzled Thorn's hand, a small, familiar gesture that only those who once shared rations in a freezing tent could truly understand. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a request. It was a signal. I know who you are, and I'm still me. Marvin had left hours ago, quietly, without a word. On the bench beside them, he'd placed a small tin box. Inside it, a few slices of cold meat and a folded scrap of paper. Eat first. I'm not hungry. -M. Thorn chuckled softly, opened the box, and tore off a piece, offering it to Kairos. The dog ate it, slowly, with care, as if afraid that finishing the meal too quickly might wake him from this dream. You're still you, Thorn said, his hand moving gently along Kairos's spine. I wasn't there when you needed me, but this time, I won't leave. The moon rose behind the trees, casting a silver light across the old scar on Kairos's hip, a scar that never faded, not because the body couldn't heal, but because some marks remain as reminders. Of a time, of a moment, of a soul that chose to sacrifice, and a choice like that deserves to be remembered, always. The next morning, Veldenmoor Park was draped in soft mist. The scent of damp earth mingled with the cool air, turning every footstep into something feather-light. Sparrows chirped from branches not yet dressed in leaves, and a few elderly walkers made their way along familiar stone paths. But for Thorn, the world had narrowed to one quiet space, beneath the old chestnut tree near the dried-up pond, where Kairos lay stretched out, his head resting gently on a weathered army backpack. Marvin arrived later than usual, his steps quick, his face carrying something he couldn't quite conceal, a mix of firmness and quiet hesitation. He didn't look at Thorn, only at Kairos, and from his coat pocket he pulled out a small can of dog food, placing it gently on the grass. "You're not the first to try and claim him back," Marvin began, his voice casual, though his eyes never strayed from the dog. Thorn set his coffee down and looked up, his gaze calm. "I didn't come to claim him back. I came to stay." Marvin squinted slightly. "And how's that any different?" Thorn didn't respond immediately. He reached down, gently stroking Kairos's back. The dog nudged his head slightly, not opening his eyes, but acknowledging the touch as if in silent agreement. "The difference," Thorn said softly, "is that I'm not here to drag him back into the past. I want to walk forward with him, if he still has the strength." Marvin sat down across from him, smoothing his jacket beneath him, then looked Thorn directly in the eyes for the first time that morning. "Did you know he stopped eating for 3 days after a cop tried to force me to turn him into a shelter?" he said, voice low but steady. "The guy brought handcuffs, said the dog was unclaimed government property, told me keeping him was a violation of ownership laws." Thorn's jaw tensed. The weight of the story pressed into his chest, because once he too had believed he had a right to Kairos. "You're right," Thorn replied quietly. "Kairos isn't property, not mine, not anyone's." Silence settled between them, broken only by the faint tapping of a woodpecker somewhere beyond the trees. Kairos shifted, eyes half open, glancing at Marvin, then Thorn. No tension, no confusion, just an alert, steady gaze, as if saying, "I'm watching both of you." "You were with him through the hardest months," Thorn continued, voice low but grounded. "There's no way I can ever repay you, but I also can't just walk away pretending I never saw him again. So I'll stay, that's all." Marvin kept looking at him, and this time, the edge in his stare had softened, just a little. "You a soldier?" Thorn nodded. "Special Ops Joint Task Force. Kairos was enlisted, literally." Marvin drew in a quiet breath, leaned back against the tree, and looked up through the thinning branches where sunlight filtered in. "Funny," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Even soldiers know how to choose their people." Kairos stood up. Not because he was called, not for any reason in particular. He walked between them and lay down again, resting his head in the space right between where the two men sat. An impartial choice, a quiet statement. Thorn glanced at Marvin and smiled faintly. "Maybe there's nothing more we need to say." Marvin let out a dry but genuine chuckle. "First time a dog ever forced me into a truce." From that moment, something shifted. Not suddenly, not clearly, but undeniably. An invisible wall, one that had separated both men from the world, from their pasts, and perhaps even from themselves, had started to crack. Later that afternoon, Marvin invited Thorn to visit his makeshift shelter, a small space beneath the East Bridge overpass where Kairos had spent his earliest nights. Beneath the dim light slipping through gaps in the concrete, there was a tattered quilt, a battered transistor radio missing its antenna, and a simple wooden frame. Inside wasn't a photo of family or loved ones, but a hand-drawn sketch. Kairos asleep beneath the bridge, Marvin sitting behind him, playing a harmonica. "You drew this?" Thorn asked. "Number A volunteer girl made it. Gave it to me one day. Reminded me that I still exist in someone's eyes." Thorn stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small item, a tarnished bronze unit badge. "I kept this too, just to remind myself that I survived, and that maybe there's still a reason to keep going." Marvin accepted it without a word, placed it gently beside the radio. They were no longer two strangers locked in quiet conflict over a dog. They were two men who had lost more than they could ever say, and who now, somehow, were rediscovering pieces of themselves in the same pair of eyes. Eyes that had seen enough of death to know what it meant to keep showing up, for loyalty that asked for nothing but presence. Kairos lay between them, his head resting on Thorn's leg, hind legs stretched toward Marvin, a silent but enduring bridge connecting lives worn thin by time, yet still warm enough to share. Thorn's home sat at the end of a narrow street on the outskirts of Hartsbridge, where the rooftops were low and quiet, as if even time moved slower there. Spring hadn't fully arrived, but the air had softened, enough to leave the windows cracked open and let the breeze slip through the curtains. He pulled the car up to the front gate, turned off the engine, and sat still for a moment, his chest heavy, as if he had carried the entire frame of an old memory on his shoulders. In the back seat, Kairos lay curled, his head resting on Thorn's old jacket. Throughout the long drive from Veldenmoor, he hadn't moved once. No whimpers, no protest, just silence, the kind worn by warriors who have seen too much and no longer beg for anything. "We're home," Thorn said softly, like an introduction between two friends who once lost each other somewhere in a war zone. He opened the car door, stepped out, and gently lifted Kairos into his arms. Though the dog's frame was lean, Thorn still felt the full weight, of not just a body, but of the silent, burdened years this creature had carried, alone. The house was small. 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a tidy kitchen, and a wooden table by the window where Thorn used to read the morning paper. The air held the scent of old books, aged timber, and the faint trace of coffee lingering from that morning's brew. As he stepped across the threshold, he wondered, would Kairos remember this place? Years ago, before deployment, this had been his first training ground. He'd once dozed at Thorn's feet here during quiet afternoon drills. He laid Kairos down on a small bed, padded with a thick blanket beside the fireplace, then stepped back. The dog didn't move, eyes half shut, breath even but shallow. Thorn sat across from him, doing nothing else, no commands, no calls, just being there. Because in this moment, presence mattered more than action. After a while, Thorn rose and went into the kitchen. He prepared a plate of stew, Kairos' favorite from the old days, with chopped vegetables, warmed it gently, and placed it into a ceramic bowl. He brought it over. No response. Kairos didn't stir, only his right ear twitched faintly, like catching a distant sound, then stilled again. Thorn wasn't discouraged. He set the bowl down and pulled another blanket over Kairos, not for warmth, but as a gesture of embrace. A way to say, "You're safe now." The warm light in the room had been dimmed to a low amber glow, casting soft shadows across the floor like velvet. Thorn sat in the armchair, a cooling cup of tea beside him. Resting on his knees was an old leather journal, the field log he hadn't opened since his discharge. On the first page, scribbled in faded blue ink, were words that stopped his breath for a beat. "Not every day has hope, but if Kairos is alive, there's still a way home." He read the line slowly. It didn't hurt. But it did make him pause, draw in a breath, and surrender himself to a tide of memory. The night passed quietly. At midnight, the clock struck 12. Kairos remained still, a silhouette of who he had been, but as dawn neared, Thorn caught something small. The dog's gaze, just slightly opened, was fixed in his direction, not lost like in the park, anchored. He didn't move closer, just smiled and said gently, "You don't have to try. Just being here is enough." Kairos didn't respond, not in any dramatic way, but the tip of his nose shifted slightly, a subtle sign, soft as breath. It was enough. Enough for Thorn to know Kairos recognized the space, knew he wasn't alone anymore, and more importantly, was beginning to allow himself to believe again. Morning broke. A thin beam of sunlight pierced through the curtains, casting a stripe of pale gold between Thorn and Kairos. Neither of them had slept. But they weren't fully awake either. They simply were, sharing the kind of silence that didn't require effort or explanation. A warrior slowly rising again, cradled in the arms of the man who had once called him sacred. That first night didn't end with tears, nor fear. It ended with something smaller, but more precious. Peace. A peace that didn't need words, only presence. Tuesday morning arrived with a slanted glow through the windows of a small coffee shop on Elderbridge Street. Thorn pushed open the wooden door, the bell above it letting out a soft chime. The room was warm, scented with cinnamon and freshly roasted beans, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the back corner table, where a woman with ash-brown curls was hunched over a laptop, stirring her black Americano absent-mindedly. Esri Calwin. Her name didn't call up images of news programs or bylines for Thorn. It brought back a voice on a sandstorm-rattled night at the Takhar logistics base, wrapped in a scarf, yelling into a radio. "A dog just saved a man from a landmine. I want to know his name." She looked up. The face was unchanged, eyes sharp, practiced at cutting through noise. But for one fleeting second, the soft curve at the edge of her mouth made her smile feel less like a journalist's, and more like someone who'd just rediscovered something she never gave up hoping for. "Still taking it black? No cream, no sugar?" she asked. Thorn smiled. "You remember?" "More than remember." She closed her laptop and offered her hand. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Thorn Allister." He shook her hand, feeling the firm, honest grip, rare in her line of work. They sat down. Between them were 2 coffees, a laptop, and a shared memory buried deep but never lost. Esri didn't waste time. "I saw a clip online yesterday morning. A German shepherd darting into the street to save a child, then collapsing right in the middle of traffic while cars slammed to a stop in panic. You know what I saw in that frame?" Thorn didn't answer. He already knew. "Those eyes," she said, unblinking. "They were Kairos's." She opened the laptop. The paused video on the screen showed Kairos mid-turn, shielding a young girl as she stumbled in the street. His ears were pricked. His eyes flashed that familiar warning gleam. And just before the brakes screamed and the frame froze, he turned his head, searching for a familiar gaze, the same way he always had on smoke-covered ridges halfway across the world. "I never knew what happened to him after Khosra," Esri said quietly, her voice dropping lower. "I thought Kairos was dead. The unit was disbanded, every line of communication sealed, and there was never an official KIA report." "Because he didn't die," Thorn replied, eyes still fixed on the screen. "He was taken, then erased, from everything." Esri leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "That kind of disappearance, I've seen it before, especially when it involves a private contractor named Argon Watch." She pulled a thin folder from her bag, screenshots, company records, and snippets of anonymized leaked emails. Her finger tapped a page labeled with a code. K9 Decommission, Lot 43B. This is a lot of assets dissolved 3 years ago. 17 K9 dogs, all of them deployed in the Middle East. No discharge papers, no names, just numbers. The report lists them as unfit for continued service. Most of them were shipped out with no recipient on file. She paused at a line near the bottom and tapped it. 817B. Thorn's blood ran cold. That was the number etched into the faded collar tag he'd once recovered from Kairos's old supply bin. He'd thought it was just a shipping code. But now it looked more like a classification, a product label, not a name, a mark for something scheduled to be processed. Argon Watch is still active, contracted by the government to handle redeployment and rehoming of service dogs, Esri said, her voice tight. They've got offices, lawyers, PR teams, but behind the curtain, what do they actually do with the dogs that are old, broken, or too injured to be useful? She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. Thorn took a long breath. And now they know Kairos is still alive. Esri nodded. Yeah, and they won't like that. Before leaving, she rested a hand on his shoulder. I want to tell this story. Not for clicks, not for exposure, because I owe Kairos a name. And a proper thank you. You might not believe it, she added, her voice almost a whisper. But that night in Takar, I saw him charge into that smoke. When everyone else pulled back, he kept moving forward. And when he turned around, he didn't look for help. He looked for you. Thorn didn't speak, just gave her a nod. The kind of nod that meant I understand, with a debt not paid in words, but in the life that followed. That afternoon, when Thorn returned home, he opened the door and saw Kairos no longer lying by the fireplace. The dog was standing now, steady on his feet. He walked toward the door, not barking, not wagging his tail, just standing there, eyes locked on Thorn's. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and leaned his head into Thorn's chest. A moment that felt like a seal, a pact silently remade between two souls ready to return to the fight, not for medals, but for truth. The morning sky was veiled with silk-thin clouds, and the sun hadn't yet pierced through fully, but it was warm enough to light the wooden porch behind Thorn's house. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and the subtle steam rising from a cup of hot tea he had brewed for Esri. She sat across from him, elbows resting on the table, eyes focused on a small object between them. A stack of color-printed photographs, their edges worn, some yellowing faintly at the corners, signs of years folded, carried, kept close, as if the one who held them never dared to let the memory fade. Are you sure he'll remember? Esri asked, her voice almost a whisper. Thorn didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the garden where Kairos lay. Sunlight cast a gentle glow over his thin frame, making the gray in his fur shimmer gold. His ears stood pointed, alert, though he barely moved. Eyes shut, the posture of someone not asleep, but waiting to be awakened by something deeper than instinct. He hasn't forgotten, Thorn said at last, gaze unmoving. He's just waiting for the right moment to remember. Esri gave a soft nod. She picked one photo from the stack and slid it across the table toward him. It was taken during the Khosra campaign, Thorn leaning against a sandbag wall, Kairos curled close beside him, eyes wide open like a sentinel guarding the sky itself. Dust. Sweat. And yet something clear in that image, a stillness that could only come from absolute loyalty in the midst of chaos. Thorn picked up the photo and stood. He walked slowly toward the garden. Kairos, he called, his voice low but gentle. The dog stirred, eyes opened, not startled, not confused. The look lasted just a beat longer than usual, as if his mind needed time to search through the emotional archive, long buried under years of silence. Thorn knelt. He didn't thrust the photo forward. He raised it gently with both hands, offering it at eye level, a gesture not of command, but of respect. He laid it in the grass, just inches from Kairos's nose. Kairos blinked, sniffed once, then again. And then, like passing through an invisible doorway in time, he lifted his head, shifted forward, and touched his nose to the edge of the photograph. He didn't lick it, didn't bite. He just touched it and held still. Esri held her breath. Thorn's eyes turned glassy. He whispered, voice trembling. No command. And still, he remembers. Kairos lifted his head, his gaze fixed directly on Thorn, not questioning, not seeking reassurance. In that moment, something passed between them that made Esri turn her face away. There was no need for language anymore, because between a man and a dog like this, words had never been necessary. He sees himself, Thorn murmured, his hand gliding gently down Kairos's spine. Esri stood behind them, both hands wrapped around her tea, eyes still shimmering. I once heard that a dog's scent memory is stronger than any image, but what I saw just now, it was as if Kairos had stepped back onto the battlefield, for a split second, to confirm that everything that happened was real. Thorn nodded, carefully taking the photo and tucking it into a worn leather notebook. Maybe memory doesn't live in the brain at all, but in the one place Kairos never lost, his heart. They returned inside. Kairos followed, his steps steadier than the day before. He didn't move fast, but the difference was undeniable. He had risen without being called. A small gesture, but one that carried the weight of will. In the living room, Esri spread the documents across the table. Maps tracking canine transfers, asset decommission lists sorted by ID codes, files of dogs who disappeared without a single record returned after leaving service. One line stood out. Transitional Unit -817-B. This, she said, tapping the page, is Kairos's classification. Argon Watch listed him under non-redeployable, low recovery value. Thorn clenched his fist. Value, he repeated, voice catching. To them, that's all that matters. If a dog can't fight or be retrained, they mark it as depreciated property, just another item written off. The room fell silent. By the door, Kairos stood still, his eyes no longer clouded, clear, watchful, and somehow aware. As if he understood, in some silent way, that his very existence had once been weighed and deemed unworthy by a system that no longer recognized loyalty as value. We're not letting this continue, Esri said firmly. He remembers. That means we have to remember for the ones who won't get the chance to. That evening, as Thorn switched on the porch light, Kairos came to lie down beside his chair, just like he once had beneath foreign skies in Khosra. But now, there were no bombs overhead, no radios filled with static, only the sound of crickets in the tall grass and the whisper of wind weaving through the budding trees. You really do remember, Thorn whispered, and this time, I won't let that memory fade again. Kairos rested his chin on Thorn's leg, eyes gently closing, not as surrender, but as trust. A quiet acceptance. As if, at long last, the long journey back into memory had finally found something solid to rest upon. That morning, Thorn's kitchen glowed softly in the early sun, filtering through the glass panes. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, slow and steady, blending with the rhythmic tapping of keys, unhurried, yet carrying the quiet determination of someone who had made up their mind. Esri sat before her laptop, while Thorn stood behind her, holding a warm cup of tea, his eyes fixed on the screen filled with encrypted data lines. There, Esri pointed at a file titled Canine Trans File, Class N17. Kairos was part of this group. Thorn took a seat, his expression tightening as the contents loaded on screen. Non-operational unit, N17. A category for dogs deemed beyond active service, evaluated as no longer mission effective after sustaining injuries or psychological damage. In the status column, transferred Argon Watch facilities, redacted location. No names, no dates, No signing officer, just a single all-caps line. Access restricted. Permission level 5 plus. This is where all public trails end, Esri murmured, eyes scanning the locked document. The N-17 files were sealed at the military level, which means someone deliberately erased their traces. Thorne placed the teacup down and pressed his lips into a hard line. Wiped names, reassigned codes, scrubbed them out of the system, like these lives were just defective merchandise. He leaned forward, gently patting Kairos, who lay curled near the fireplace with his head resting on a small cushion. The dog lifted his gaze, not fully understanding the words, but clearly listening with something deeper than language. His eyes were brighter today, alert in a way that said he understood the weight in the room. He was part of a real unit, Thorne said quietly. And 17 wasn't a discard list. It was made of survivors from the kinds of missions no one wants to speak of. All morning, they worked. Esri used her journalist credentials to dig into defense archives. Little by little, trails emerged, faded field reports, handwritten memos between commanders, and even a scratchy audio recording with no listed source. A man's voice, low and worn, echoed through the speaker. "We can't hold on to them forever. K9s like Kairos are too emotionally bonded, unfit for retraining. Best to let a third party handle it. We shouldn't turn this into a sentimentality issue. This is administrative, not emotional." The clip ended with the dry rustle of paper. Esri paused the audio and looked up. "Do you see it now? The entire N-17 unit, those dogs that saved lives, that served without question, have been pushed into the category of post-mission disposal, and Argon Watch was the middleman." "And how do they dispose of them?" Thorne asked, his hand gripping the chair tightly. Esri sighed. "Relocation overseas, sent to private training facilities, or sold to civilian security companies. If they don't meet the threshold, they're abandoned in holding camps. No oversight, no accountability." The air in the room grew dense. But instead of anger, Thorne's gaze deepened, settling into something steadier than rage. A resolve, quiet but immovable. "Then we follow this trail to the end, not just for Kairos, but for every soul that never got the dignity of being called by name." At noon, Thorne retrieved an old tin box from the attic. Inside were items most would have dismissed as scraps: Kairos's faded collar tag, a folded tactical map, and a torn piece of Kevlar vest still stained with dry blood. He brushed a thumb over the fabric. "He doesn't need a certificate. That scar says everything." Kairos approached without a sound, gently pressing his nose to Thorne's hand. A quiet reminder. "I hear you, and I'm ready." That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, they pinned a map to the wall and marked potential Argon Watch sites, abandoned kennels in Utah, an advanced training compound in Kansas. Every one of them shared three things: off-grid operations, no coordination, and most telling, no documented returns of dogs to their original handlers. Kairos sat beneath the map, his head tilted. He stared intently at one pin, a red mark near the Arizona border. Esri followed his gaze. "You think that's where they took him?" she asked. Thorne didn't answer immediately, but he knew. Dogs remember more than scent. They remember how a place feels, and sometimes instinct knows more than the records ever will. Night fell. Thorne turned on the desk lamp, its soft light falling across Kairos's face, no longer silent in resignation, but in the stillness of a soldier waiting for his next command. "We have our starting point," Thorne whispered. Esri nodded. "And this time, no one gets erased." By late evening, the sunset stretched long shadows across the cracked concrete beneath the East Bridge overpass. The river flowed quietly below, thick with silt, unseen and mostly forgotten. The fading light crawled over each crease in the old bridge, and in one quiet corner where few ever passed, a peaceful scene unfolded. Marvin sat slouched against a broad, concrete column, arms wrapped around a dented steel canteen, and Kairos lay curled beside him, his head resting on Marvin's leg, breathing slow and steady, like a lullaby that needed no words. Thorn and Esri approached without disturbing the moment. They sat on the other side, and it was Marvin, the silver-haired man with a face older than his years and eyes weathered by time, who spoke first, his voice steady, stripped of decoration. "The first time I saw him," he said, "was in mid-July. The sun was burning straight through your spine. I was digging through a cardboard box behind the market, looking for something edible, when I saw him, sitting at the end of the alley beside a pile of damp trash, chewing on a piece of cardboard." Esri looked at him, unable to hide the sorrow pooling in her eyes. "He wasn't playing," Marvin continued. "He was chewing, slowly, carefully, like he was trying to convince himself that the paper might for a moment make the hunger stop." Thorn lowered his head, his chest tightening. Marvin gave a quiet, brittle laugh, the kind that cracked at the edges. I stepped closer, no sound, no call, just stood there. He glanced at me, then went back to chewing. No bark, no growl, no attempt to run, his eyes. They didn't plead, didn't accuse. They simply accepted, like he'd gotten used to the idea that no one was coming. He pulled a thin cloth from his pocket, wiped his hands, then continued. I didn't have more than he did. I had nowhere to be either, but I had a can of sardines, my last one for the day. I opened it, set it down beside me. Then I sat and waited. Took nearly 10 minutes for him to come closer, not because he trusted me, but because of the smell. Instinct brought him near, but the way he ate, careful, gentle, like he was afraid of taking too much. I knew. He'd been a soldier. I've seen that look before. The three of them sat in silence beneath the shade of the bridge, the distant murmur of the river filling the air. Kairos still lay still, but his ears twitched faintly, as though he wasn't just hearing the story, but reliving it in the space that remembered everything. Marvin reached out and stroked the back of Kairos's neck. His voice dropped lower. From that day on, he followed me, not like a pet, not needy. He just walked behind me, 3 steps back, silent. Every time I stopped, so did he. I never gave him a name, but he didn't need one to exist. Thorn looked at the man, someone he'd once assumed was simply the one who kept his dog alive. But now he understood. Kairos had never been just a dog. He was a companion, a comrade, a living witness to one unshakable truth. Sometimes it's the broken souls that find each other in the furthest corners of the world. The first time I heard him make a sound, Marvin said, was on a winter night. Wind whipping, car horns echoing off the bridge. I slipped, ice underfoot, went down hard, and he rushed over, didn't bark, didn't panic, just covered me with his body like the storm could shatter me, and he was the only thing holding me together. The way he stayed with me, that's not something you can teach. Esri raised a hand to cover her mouth. Thorn turned to Kairos, who had now opened his eyes, looking back at Marvin with a clarity that needed no words. Not a reflex, a recognition. A dog who couldn't speak, but still knew how to say yes with his eyes. Marvin stood, walked to the corner of his shelter, and returned with a small wooden box. He opened the lid and pulled out a single object, a dented silver tag. No number, no name, just 2 worn words. Unit N17. This, he said, handing it to Thorn, I found on a Monday morning, caught in the old fabric cord around his neck. I never knew what it meant, but I never threw it away. Thorn took it, his hand trembling, not from cold, but from knowing that all the threads once cut were now slowly weaving back together. Thank you, he said, voice tight. He didn't lose everything. Marvin just smiled, then settled back beside Kairos. I didn't save him. He gave me a reason to wake up every morning. Some nights I'd lie there just listening to him breathe. And I knew I was still alive. When they left the shelter that day, the sky had turned a pale steel blue, promising light rain. But none of them hurried. Thorn walked in the center, Marvin on one side, Kairos between them. Not on a leash, not by command. Just three souls walking side by side, sharing the road in silence. Steady, certain. Like a wordless ballad meant only for those who understood its tune. It was a Friday afternoon that looked like any other. Clear skies, a soft breeze, and the early April air tinged with the sweetness of spring sunlight. Thorn walked with Kairos through the weekend market near Riverbend Square, past stalls lined with handmade trinkets, baked goods, and old books laid across floral cloth. Children ran without purpose. Laughter echoed between tables. Kairos moved slowly, each step measured, like someone who knew their value was never about speed, but presence. Though age and wear had softened his form, he walked with his head held high, breath even, ears flicking slightly at unfamiliar sounds. No one would have guessed he'd once been deemed unfit for service, because in his eyes still lived a warrior, even if the body had long since borne its scars. As Thorn paused at a waffle cart, exchanging words with the vendor, Kairos suddenly tensed. His body tightened, head turning sharply across the street. His eyes locked onto something. A child, no older than 5, chasing after a toy car that had rolled off the sidewalk, straight towards the road. It all happened in seconds. A black SUV was barreling down the street, the driver unaware of the child, hidden behind a thick tree trunk. A scream tore from the mother's throat behind them, but it was too late. And then, Kairos leapt. No bark, no command, just a clean, explosive launch, so fast that only a gray blur slashed diagonally across the asphalt. Thorn turned, shouting instinctively, "Kairos!" The child slipped on the pavement. In a fraction of a second, Kairos shifted his momentum, using his body to shield the child, nudging them gently toward the curb. At the same moment, the SUV screeched to a halt, the tires screaming into a long skid. But Kairos's body was already sprawled across the road, just inches from the front wheel, motionless. A crowd gathered, shouts, cries, someone calling emergency services. The child clung to their mother, sobbing, still gripping a scratched-up toy car. The driver, trembling, stepped out of the vehicle, apologizing over and over. But every pair of eyes was fixed on the dog lying silent in the street, his gray-black frame fading into the cold surface of the asphalt. Thorn rushed forward. "Kairos!" No movement. Thorn dropped to his knees, pressing his hand to the dog's chest. Weak pulse, but still there. Breath, thin as thread. "Don't do this to me," he whispered, his lips trembling. Esri, coincidentally at the market to meet Thorn, immediately pulled out her phone, dialing the emergency veterinary unit. A bystander had caught the entire event on a nearby dashcam, and within 30 minutes of the video being posted online, thousands of shares rippled across the internet like a wave breaking against the world. That evening, Kairos lay in the emergency ward of Westbridge Animal Hospital, receiving fluids, oxygen, and constant monitoring. Thorn sat outside, his head buried in his hands. Esri handed him a bottle of water, her phone in her other hand, the viral video still playing on screen. The footage was a little shaky, but didn't need narration. It began with the child darting into the road, followed by a flash of gray hurtling forward like instinct made flesh. The leap, the push, the fall. And at the end, a body lying still without a single cry. At the bottom of the video, the uploader had added one simple line. He didn't need anyone to call his name. He ran because his heart already knew what had to be done. Esri looked at Thorn. He just reminded the world what unconditional courage looks like. Thorn nodded, eyes red. The first time I ever called his name was on the battlefield. The second was in the middle of a city street. But both times he never waited for orders. He just acted, because he never forgot who he was. The next morning, Esri's article was published, called One Last Time, The Story of Kairos, the Dog Who Never Forgot His Oath. The lead image showed Kairos lying in the street, sunlight catching the scarred lines of his body, yet his dignity remained unmistakable. The story was shared over 2 million times in 24 hours. Letters poured in. Some wrote of dogs who had once saved their children. Others simply wrote, "He did what many adults wouldn't dare to." Kairos survived the crisis after 2 days. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he did was turn his head, searching for Thorn, who hadn't left the room once since he was admitted. No need for names. That one look was everything. Thorn grasped Kairos's paw and pressed his forehead to the dog's, a thank you too sacred for words. And somewhere, across the web of strangers watching from afar, millions of hearts touched something profoundly simple. That sometimes the noblest acts aren't learned. They're chosen, in the instant we decide to love without condition. The recovery room at Westbridge Animal Center was on the 3rd floor, where light filtered through frosted windows in a soft morning hue. Not blinding, but just enough to feel like dawn. In that quiet space, the rhythmic beeping of Kairos's heart monitor pulsed gently, slow, occasionally skipping a beat, but still there. The ECG lines rose and dipped like small waves on a still ocean, each fluctuation a fragile, unrelenting signal of life refusing to surrender. Thorn had been there since the night before. His back had curved with the weight of waiting, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. But they never left the gray figure on the bed. Every shallow breath Kairos took pressed against his ribs like a vice, stretching each second into something heavier than any battlefield Thorn had known. The door creaked open. Dr. Landon stepped inside, a middle-aged man with a voice like pine needles in the wind, calm but unable to fully mask the tension behind his eyes. He carried a clipboard, pulling up a chair beside Thorn. "We've done the echocardiogram, blood work, EKGs," he began, voice low and steady. "Kairos is in stage 3 heart failure. His cardiac walls are stiffening, the muscles weakening. The ejection fraction is critically low, and this condition, it wasn't caused by yesterday's trauma. It's been building for years." Thorn looked up. "Since Khosra?" The doctor nodded. Battlefield trauma, followed by years without proper treatment. He may have been living with that pain all this time. That sentence pierced Thorn like a blade, not because it was unexpected, but because it was too true. "Can he recover?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll support him with cardiac stimulants, IV fluids to improve blood flow, and strict rest. If there are no further complications, he may stabilize, but he can't take any more damage. Even a fall could be the end." Thorn bowed his head, hands clasped tight, his knuckles drained of color. "I once lived because of him," he murmured, almost to himself. "Now he lives because of me." After the doctor left, Thorn stayed behind, alone. Kairos still didn't move, but his eyelids twitched, just slightly, but enough to matter. Thorn stood, pulled his chair closer, and leaned forward until his forehead touched Kairos's, just like he had after their first mission, when they'd made it home. "You don't have to fight anymore," he whispered. "Just breathe. Just lie here. I'll take care of the rest." There was no reply, but Thorn knew, in Kairos's world, if he was here, then giving up was never an option. Esri arrived later that afternoon. She brought a small bundle, a hand-knit ash-gray scarf, an old leather-bound notebook, and a printed photo from the video that had gone viral the day before. She laid the scarf gently across Kairos's body, opened the notebook, and placed the photo on the first page. "You can write anything you want, if it helps," she said. Thorne looked at the picture, Kairos lying on the street, sunlight brushing the fur across his chest, eyes closed but peaceful, like a soldier who'd completed his final mission. Thorne picked up a pen and wrote slowly, deliberately. "The first time I called your name, you ran into a war zone. The second time, you ran into traffic. No orders, no prompting, just because you knew what was right." Esri read it, pressing her lips together, silent. She placed a hand on Thorne's shoulder, squeezing gently, a quiet gesture of strength for someone silently bearing the weight of gratitude and guilt. Kairos awoke that evening. Not abruptly, just a deeper breath, a steadier rhythm. Then his eyes opened, not as sharp as they once were, but enough to take in the room. He didn't try to sit up, just turned his head, and when his gaze found Thorne's, the man's lips trembled, not from emotion alone, but from the fragile miracle unfolding before him. In that look, there was no more distance. "Hey there," Thorne smiled, voice hoarse. "It's been a while since we've really looked at each other like this." Kairos closed his eyes again, then opened them. Once, slowly, like a silent nod. Thorne held his paw, saying nothing more. Everything had already been said. That night, Thorne never left the hospital. He slept beside the bed, his head resting on the mattress, hand still wrapped around Kairos's paw. Outside, the wind stirred gently, streetlights casting blurred trails of light across the fogged pavement. And in that dim glow, a picture took shape, of a man, a dog, and an invisible tether between them, not forged by paperwork or ownership, but by a survival that had been shared. On the first morning after Kairos came back to them, the sun rose earlier than usual. Light filtered through the recovery room's sheer curtains, spilling across the dog's silver-gray chest as he lay still, his eyes half open. Thorne sat beside him, still in yesterday's shirt, hand resting on Kairos's paw, as if afraid that letting go might invite the world to steal this moment away once more. And then, in that almost frozen stillness, a new sound rose. Not the monitors, not a nurse's footsteps, but Esri's phone vibrating insistently. She had just stepped into the room and was already backing out onto the balcony, her eyes wide in disbelief. "I think this just exploded," she said, voice slightly hoarse. The night before, after Kairos regained consciousness, Esri had re-edited the video, the one where he saved the child. This time she added a single line to the title. "Courage needs no call, and the dog's forgotten after war." Below it, a single hashtag, #, silent valor, no marketing strategy, no SEO campaign, just the honest words of someone who had seen it with her own eyes. Within 8 hours, the video surpassed 5 million views. Over 10,000 shares followed, each with its own caption. "I once knew a dog like this. They saved us, and then we forgot them. I want to call his name. One last time." In a small corner of a used bookstore in Austin, a veteran posted a black and white photo with a dog named Rambo. The caption read, "He led me out of a booby-trapped house in 2003. I never saw him again." In San Diego, a teenage girl shared a voice recording from her father, a recon soldier, telling how his dog Goliath had leapt from a medevac helicopter to stay with a wounded man when the order came to retreat. And across thousands of other street corners, names long buried in faded records began to surface again. Max, Tango, Argo, Blue, Coda, Shiloh, Hawk, Zion, Kairos. Esri's workspace had transformed into a memory reception center. Her inbox was filled with handwritten letters, photographs, old reports, and video clips. Each name, each coat of fur, each gaze captured in those submissions was a fragment of loyalty that had never aged. People didn't forget, she told Thorn. They just needed a reason to remember. On social media, the hashtag #SilentValor appeared alongside hundreds of paintings, songs, and short poems. A painter in Chicago illustrated the moment Kairos lay in the middle of the street, a child sitting up behind him, light falling over the dog like a quiet halo. A guitarist in Oregon composed a piece titled Kairos Breath, its melody light as a whisper, yet steady like a heartbeat, affirming that silent life always hums beneath the surface. National television covered the story. Evening anchors recited the title of Esri's now viral article, "One Last Time to Be Called by Name." The editor-in-chief of the Washington Sentinel personally emailed Esri, inviting her to lead a dedicated column on canine brotherhood and the bonds beyond war. A state senator from Montana addressed Congress. "If a dog can still protect us long after we've stopped believing in them, then perhaps it's time we protect them, and those like them, from the deafening silence after war." At the hospital, Kairos remained under special care, but his spirit shifted day by day. No longer lost, his eyes held a quiet awareness. Thorn sat by his side, reading letters sent by strangers, many addressed directly to Kairos. One letter, handwritten in shaky strokes, read, "I'm 86. I once had a four-legged friend named Rex. He saved my life when I was a private. Thank you for helping me remember." Thorn wiped his eyes. Kairos gently tapped his paw against Thorn's hand, an unspoken nod between comrades. Esri filmed a short clip. Thorn, reading letters beside Kairos. No script, no music, just a real moment. Her caption, "He once lived because of Kairos. Now Kairos lives because of him. And we, all of us, live because of the memories these souls chose to keep alive." As night fell, America continued to speak the name Silent Valor. But in one quiet corner, where Kairos slept beneath the soft glow of a hospital lamp, and Thorn's hand offered steady warmth, the movement had become more than a hashtag. It had become a promise that no one would ever be erased from the list again. One overcast afternoon in Salt Hollow, a quiet suburb nearly 2 hours from Westbridge, light rain began to fall. Not enough to soak the ground, but enough to scatter light through the beads forming on tin rooftops. Thorn sat in a simple wooden cafe, hands wrapped around a cup of steaming coffee, his gaze distant through the fogged-up window. At his feet, Kairos curled beside him, head resting gently on Thorn's boot, eyes serene. The door creaked open. A tall man entered, broad shoulders, wearing a worn brown leather jacket. Light from the ceiling spilled over his face, revealing a scar that traced from his forehead down across his left cheekbone. Though faded, it was unmistakable. His left eye was clouded, but the right one gleamed, a blend of suspicion and something too heavy to name. Ronan Bael, former Delta Force, a silent legend from missions no journalist had ever been allowed to report. And above all, the man who had lost his four-legged partner, Nix, to Argonne Watch 8 years ago. "You're the one with Kairos?" Ronan asked, his deep southern accent coloring the air. Thorn nodded. "Not with. We found each other again." Ronan sat down, his eyes falling on Kairos. He didn't reach out or speak, but his furrowed brow relaxed, just slightly, like hearing an old war song hummed beneath someone's breath. "My Nix had that same look," Ronan murmured. 10 years ago she pulled me from a minefield in Kunduz. A month later they tagged her N17, and she vanished. Thorn straightened. There was a blade in that voice, one that had never been drawn but never dulled. "No report, no return, no grave. Just gone," Ronan continued. "They told me I had no right to ask. Technically, she didn't belong to me." The silence that followed felt too full to break. Kairos remained still, eyes closed, listening not with ears, but with the whole of his being. "You know what they did?" Ronan placed a USB drive on the table. 3 years, 3 hacker friends, a debt I may never repay. But I got this. Esri arrived moments later. She plugged the USB into her laptop. The screen filled with encrypted maps, kennel codes, shipment logs, transfer pathways. A digital map unfolded, red dots linking together into a web stretching from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria to domestic points across the U.S. Thorne sat frozen. All K-9 units discharged. Ronan nodded. Split into 3 groups. He pointed to the screen, civilian retraining. Dogs still healthy, redirected to security firms or obedience academies. Neural research facilities, most without any re-entry logs. Gentle disposal, written in light gray font, struck through with no further explanation. Esri zoomed in on a small symbol in the corner of the map. A triangle containing the number 43B, identical to the batch code once stamped on Kairos's collar. "This was his group," she whispered. Thorne clenched his fists, eyes darkening. Soft disposal, a phrase that sounded gentle but concealed a brutal truth. Dogs deemed to have no more value were quietly put down. No records, no ceremonies, no one left to mourn them. Ronan looked at Kairos once more. His scar, the way he lies down, the eyes when he looks back, it's just like Nick's. I don't know if you believe in these things, but when I saw Kairos in that video, I cried, not from sorrow, but because I realized I still owe a soul who once protected me at any cost. That afternoon, the 3 of them sat together and began to plan. They would track down one of the gray zone sites, a deserted farm on the outskirts of Arizona, previously listed as a veterinary rehab center. According to the data, it was also the last location where the 43B group had transmitted any signal. By then, Kairos had fully awakened. He stood, walked on his own toward the window, where the last light of the day filtered through. He lifted his head, blinking slowly, as if calling the wind, preparing himself for another journey. And in that golden light, their 4 shadows, Thorne, Ronan, Esri, and Kairos, stretched across the wooden cafe wall like silent witnesses standing at the door of a new chapter. A chapter not written to point fingers, but to call back the rightful names of the souls who had been forgotten. Just as dawn broke, a message arrived in Esri's encrypted inbox. No subject line. The sender was anonymous. The IP address had been scrubbed 3 times through Tor layers. The message contained only 1 line. I can't stay silent anymore. I was part of it. Call me Lumen. Attached was a 6-page PDF titled Argon Watch Classified K-9 Inventory Codes and Operational Status Mapping. Esri gasped. Her hands trembled as she pulled her chair closer and opened the laptop in front of Thorne and Ronan. This came from the inside. The first page listed K-9 classifications, sorted into 3 disposal tiers. A-class, suitable for civilian reassignment, security, reconnaissance, retraining. C-class, physically or psychologically irreparable, recommended for termination. B-class, the grayest area, temporarily non-recoverable, pending evaluation or special handling. And under B-class, a code appeared, one Thorne had never forgotten. 817-B. Esri enlarged the description field. The note was brief, clinical, cold. B-class K-9 units carry no commercial value. Initiate soft liquidation protocol if held beyond 180-day review limit. Thorne's voice cracked. Soft liquidation. What does that mean? Ronan was quiet. Then, with a slow, grave tone, he replied, "It means they won't kill them outright, but they'll let them die. Slowly." Esri kept reading. At the bottom of the document, Lumen had highlighted one final note. Expired B-Class units may be deleted from internal databases with no recovery or death confirmation required. Related items, metal tags, collars, are to be treated as internal memorabilia, bearing no legal identity value. She scrolled to the image section. There it was. A blackened silver collar, code 817-B, etched into the plate, identical to the one that had once hung around Kairos's neck. Thorne stood, walking toward the window as though needing to breathe, just to hold on to his composure. Morning light cast its reflection in his eyes, something caught between pain and fire. They treated him like property, he said quietly, without turning back. A defective product, and when he no longer generated profit, they just let him fade, as if he had never existed. Kairos lay nearby, his head tilted toward Thorne, eyes locked. He didn't bark. He didn't move. But those eyes, clear, alert, and most of all, understanding. "No, Kairos," Thorne whispered, stepping closer. "You were never property. You are a living memory. You are the truth. And no matter how cold a system tries to erase you, loyalty is something no code can ever destroy." Esri checked the inbox again. Another message from Lumen had just arrived. "I cannot go public, but I have more data, a full shipment chart of all B-Class movements from the past 3 years. Kairos, Nyx, 11 others, all disappeared after entering the Cedra Valley facility." "Cedra Valley," Thorne repeated. "It matches the location from the old map." Esri looked up. "That means everything aligns, the coordinates, the codes, the transport logs, and now, direct evidence." Ronan exhaled, as if finally confirming a suspicion he'd carried for nearly a decade. Kairos made it out of that machine, and if one dog survived, it means many others never had that chance. That afternoon, they printed every file from Lumen, charted every path, cross-referenced satellite images. Each arrow, each timestamp was linked together. A map of the missing was drawn, and Kairos, finally, was the first light to return from the dark. Thorne retrieved the old collar, code 817-B, now stripped of its lifeless designation. It was no longer just a number. It was evidence. It was a symbol. It was a siren. "Kairos isn't just alive," he said, voice steady, eyes locked ahead. "He is a witness." The sun had begun to set. The only light in the room came from a desk lamp, casting long shadows of 3 humans and 1 dog against the wall, like a still frame from a story that wasn't over. No one spoke, but each of them knew. The time for action had arrived. And just then, Esri's phone lit up. Her latest video, the breakdown of code 817-B, narrated with Kairos's story, had reached 20 million views. The hashtag #SilentValor now carried a new line beneath it. "Call it by its rightful name. Never let loyalty be the target of liquidation." That day, Washington, D.C. was colder than usual, despite it being mid-spring. A fine mist of rain drifted down like a translucent veil over the granite steps of the Capitol building. But inside, the air was heavier, not with moisture, but with the weight of what was about to unfold. A special hearing before the Committee on Homeland Security and Veterans Affairs, held for the first time to address a single, unprecedented topic: reevaluation of post-service military K-9 management policies. The first witness on the list, Thorne Allister. Presentation subject: Kairos, from code 817-B to a symbol of survival. The hearing chamber was clad in oak panels, softly lit under recessed lighting. 2 broadcast cameras were stationed at opposing angles. Thorne sat at the center, a microphone fixed before him, his nameplate beside a large printed photo. Kairos lying on the pavement, sunlight cutting across his shoulder, eyes closed, not in surrender, but in quiet defiance. Esri sat just behind him, next to Ronan. Both stared ahead, not at the cameras, but at the man who had once been a soldier, then a survivor, and now a voice for those who no longer had one. "Members of the committee," Thorne began. His voice didn't shake, but it carried the gravity of years compressed into a few syllables. "I'm not here to tell a sad story. I'm here to speak a truth, that we once erased brave lives from our systems simply because they no longer held performance value." He paused, then laid his hand gently on the photo of Kairos. "This is Kairos. His classification was 817B. The internal report labeled him no longer commercially viable, recommended for soft disposal." A light tap of a pen echoed from one of the representatives. Thorne met every gaze without flinching. "He once took a landmine for me in Kasra. He saved a child in the middle of the road in Westbridge, and he survived a system that tried to make him vanish." The chamber fell into silence. Senators stopped writing. One moderator straightened up in his chair, brows furrowed, as if trying to capture every word. It was no longer a hearing. It had become a silent vigil for loyalty long abandoned. Thorne opened a stack of papers, not reports, but letters sent in from across America as part of the number sign Silent Valor campaign. He drew the first one. "I'm 5 years old. I have a dog named Bruno. When Bruno gets old, I promise not to leave him. Ethan, California." Then another, "I lost my leg in Fallujah. My dog was named Shiloh. He lost a leg too, but he never once stepped back. Paul Granger, retired Marine. We once trusted our lives to beings who never lied, never betrayed, and never compromised with cowardice," Thorne continued, his eyes burning brighter now. "And yet, when they could no longer serve, they were moved to the deletion queue. No grave, no name, not even one final call." He lowered his head, fingers curling into a fist. "When I found Kairos, he was lying under a tree, skin clinging to bone, eyes looking at me with no hope left. He didn't beg, because he never knew how to." Thorne took a deep breath, raised his head, and spoke. Deliberate, clear, each word etched into the room. Kairos never asked to be honored. He only ever needed to be called by his real name. No one spoke, not a single murmur, only the sound of silence, heavier than applause, spreading from the seats to the ceiling and through every screen broadcasting the hearing live across the country. In the hallway afterward, a small crowd gathered around Thorne. Some were veterans, some were journalists. Among them was a 12-year-old girl holding a puppy in her arms. She reached out, touching the cuff of his sleeve, eyes wide and glistening. "Are you Kairos's person?" Thorne crouched down and smiled softly. "Number I'm the one Kairos chose." That night, Thorne's testimony went viral across platforms. His final words became a second hashtag to follow. #, Silent Valor, #, call them by name. A photo captured of Thorne standing beside Kairos's portrait, hand resting on the faded nameplate, was shared over 1 million times within 12 hours. People began rewriting the names of their dogs. Bruno, Zeke, Riven, Ghost, Kairos, like a promise. A ceremony of remembrance, one final time, not as farewell, but as confirmation. They lived, and they are still here. Spring arrived slowly in Veldenmoor. Patches of leftover snow melted like silent tears, weaving between fresh blades of grass that had just begun to rise. The old park, long forgotten in the wake of the city's development, had once again become a beacon, reborn through a name whispered over the past few months. Kairos. That day the sky was spotless, not a single cloud. The sunlight was gentle, pale gold, dusting the wooden benches, freshly cleaned and neatly arranged around the small plaza at the heart of the park. At the center of the field, beneath the ancient tree where Kairos had first been found, a new statue stood. It had yet to be unveiled, but by early morning the people had already begun arriving. They didn't come out of curiosity. They came because it felt necessary, as if not standing here today would mean missing something sacred, something this city rarely experienced. A moment to touch gratitude with their own hands. The statue was cast in brass, life-sized. Kairos was not depicted growling, nor posed heroically on a pedestal, but lying down, head slightly tilted, eyes gazing into the distance, exuding a calm presence as if captured in the stillness of a quiet afternoon. Beside his paws, a stone plaque bore a single line. No date of birth, no decorated record, no ranks required. He never asked anything, but he answered every question about loyalty. Marvin Ashwell. Marvin didn't speak at the ceremony, but he was there, seated in the back row, a hand-carved wooden cane resting against his leg, head slightly bowed, as if listening not to the speakers, but to something resonating deep within. When the host invited Thorn to step forward, the entire gathering fell silent. He walked slowly, not in uniform, not wearing medals, just a charcoal shirt, sleeves rolled up like when he used to walk Kairos through the weekend markets. "We're not building a statue of a dog," Thorn began. "We're rebuilding a part of ourselves that once forgot how to look at courage." He paused for a moment, eyes resting on the statue of Kairos, before turning to face the crowd. He wasn't trained to save people, but he did it anyway. Not because he was ordered, not for reward, but because his heart knew it was right. A breeze passed through, soft, but enough to stir the leaves behind the sculpture. He survived war, survived nameless camps, survived a system that treated loyalty like something you could liquidate. But he didn't survive alone. We survived together, because he preserved what was human in me when I no longer knew who I was. Esri captured a short clip. The people of Veldenmoor standing quietly around the statue, placing their hands gently on the stone base. A 9-year-old girl brought a crayon drawing, a large dog lying beside a small boy curled around a pillow. She placed it at the statue's feet, saying nothing. An elderly man laid down a military dog tag, wrapped in a handkerchief, then stepped back with reddened eyes. Nearby, a family placed a bouquet of sunflowers with a handwritten note. "For the dog who taught my son what courage means." Even after the ceremony ended, the park remained full. Thorn, Esri, Marvin, and Ronan stood together, saying nothing grand, simply watching as people came one by one to touch the statue's cheek, as if each were entrusting it with something deeply personal. Kairos wasn't at the ceremony. He was resting in a quiet recovery room at the veterinary center, on IV fluids, under observation. But as the event wrapped up, Thorn received a message from the vet. "He stood up on his own this morning. Didn't need help." Thorn smiled, his eyes glowing like sunlight filtering through new leaves. He didn't need to stand in the crowd. He was already there, in every single one of them. By late afternoon, the sun leaned westward, casting the statue's long shadow across the grass. Children played around it, unafraid, unrestrained. A little boy kicked a ball that rolled near the statue, paused, then turned to his mother and asked, "Who is this dog, Mom?" She knelt beside him, held him close, and softly replied, "He's the one who never asked questions, but always answered at the right time." 1 week after Kairos' statue was unveiled, Esri Calwin's inbox nearly burst, not with thank you messages, but with untold stories. Thousands of emails, handwritten letters, voice recordings, even old helmet cam footage began flooding in without warning. The senders were veterans, widows, former base staff who'd worked with K9S, children who'd grown up but never forgotten the gaze of a 4-legged soul who once lay beside them when the world slept. Esri printed every case file, posted photos on her wall, placed metal tags side by side. She didn't write another article. Instead, she launched a website, www.secondflame.org, a digital sanctuary to preserve, tell, and connect the stories that had never been officially recorded. The homepage was simple, a photo of Kairos lying under the Veldenmoor tree. Below the logo, a single line read, "The Second Flame, for the lives that once lit our path through the dark, and now deserve warmth in return." Each record held a dedicated page: Marlowe, K9 Scout, Afghanistan 2010. Vanished after being coded 229-C. Elsa, 9/11 rescue dog, never listed in post-service care records. Bishop, pulled 2 soldiers from a collapsed bunker. Never returned. Whereabouts unknown. Every story included photos, training dates, excerpts from testimonies, and a button that read, "I know more about this dog." Below each one, hundreds of comments formed threads. Some recognized their unit. Some claimed to have seen the dog in abandoned training facilities in Colorado. Some simply wrote, "I remember the smell of his wet fur after the rain." Meanwhile, on the east side of Veldenmoor, an old warehouse was being transformed. The cement walls were torn down, replaced by glass doors that welcomed in the sun. The back lawn was newly seeded with sunflowers and white daisies. At the center, a hand-carved wooden sign was mounted. Second Flame, Rehabilitation and Sanctuary for Post-Service K9s. There were no cages, no iron bars, only warm rooms with wooden floors, soft beds, and natural light. Here, dogs weren't called by codes. Each had a name, a portrait on the wall, a record detailing their service, and on every bed a small piece of fabric stitched with one line, "Welcome home." On the first day, 4 dogs were brought in. Rafa, a former mine detection dog, blind in his right eye. Hank, a K9 once deployed against human trafficking rings, now struggling with severe arthritis. Ruby, a rescue diver dog who served for 7 years, haunted by frequent nightmares. Tusk, old, but still instinctively drawn to lie beside anyone in the room whose breathing was faint. They didn't arrive to applause, but through quiet, measured steps, carrying something that needed no training: the instinct to protect. Kairos came too, but not to stay, just to visit. As he entered the main room, the other dogs all stood. No barking, no noise. But something shifted in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement among a species that never needed language to understand each other. Kairos walked a slow circle, then stopped before Ruby, the trembling dog curled in a corner. He gently placed his muzzle on her back. No pressure, just a touch. And in that moment, Ruby stopped shaking. Esri stood by the window, eyes shimmering. "This," she whispered, "isn't a rescue shelter. This is where dying embers are kept safe." Thorn, standing beside her, nodded. "He doesn't need a debt repaid, but we owe something to all the souls like him, stories no one heard, yet still alive, still quietly burning." A week later, a new map appeared in Thorn's office. Not a tactical chart, nor one tracking Argon Watch transport routes. It was a map of proposed Second Flame centers, spreading to other states: Virginia, Texas, Colorado, Oregon. People sent letters asking for franchise rights. Volunteers wrote in, offering to be caregivers. A young veterinarian from Seattle wrote, "I want to use my degree to heal the lives that once saved ours." And as the afternoon sun dimmed, Kairos lay on the old porch, head resting on Thorn's leg. Both gazed toward the horizon, saying nothing. But in their silence, the same echo stirred within them, like voices from once-forgotten stories, now slowly reigniting. The first snowfall in Veldenmoor didn't come as a surprise. The forecast had predicted it for a week, but no one was quite prepared for the way it fell. Slow, delicate, as if each flake carried a whisper no one could fully hear. Winter has come, but this time, it's no longer cold. Kairos stood at the edge of Thorn's porch. The wind howled past the rooftop, sharp with winter's bite, but Kairos did not flinch. His 4 paws pressed into the snow, leaving firm, visible prints. His ears tilted, head held high, not in pride, but in something closer to affirmation. Thorn sat on the steps, holding an old wool scarf Esri had knitted. He didn't speak. He simply watched Kairos walk, small steps, unhurried but steady. Each step was a victory, each lift of the paw from the snow a silent testimony. I'm still here. It had taken Kairos nearly 2 months to recover from heart failure. Week by week, dose by dose, exercise by tiny exercise, lifting a paw, maintaining balance, walking 3 steps without gasping. But this time, there was no one commanding him forward. And somehow, without pressure, he made progress in his own way. Thorn often sat beside him, not to train, not to command, but simply to tell stories. Meandering tales of the first spring rain, of a childhood hike through the woods, of the sister he lost at age 6, and of the day he first named Kairos, not by code, not by orders from above, but because of the way the dog looked at him in that moment, as if the whole world was wrapped in a single nod. That day was December 24th. Outside the house, Christmas lights twinkled, wrapped around the porch railing like strands of time. Inside, a small pine tree stood, modestly decorated with silver balls, tinsel, and 3 hand-stitched stockings hanging by the fireplace. One of them was embroidered with the name Kairos. Esri arrived with a canvas bag full of letters, messages from all across America. She set it on the table, a gentle smile warming her face. "We got over 800 letters this week," she said. "People want to say thank you. Not just because Kairos saved a child, but because they feel saved." Thorn opened each letter. Some were handwritten, the ink blurred with tears. Others came from children, with crayon drawings of big, gentle dogs, always with wings. A boy named Milo wrote, "I used to be scared of dogs, but after watching Kairos, I asked my mom to let me adopt one. I named him Hero, just like Kairos, because he does good things and doesn't ask for candy." When the clock struck 8 p.m., Thorn opened the front door. Kairos stepped out beside him. The glow of the Christmas lights danced across his face, highlighting the graying fur that had aged with time, but couldn't dim the brilliance in his eyes. Thorn looked down at his old friend. "Ready for a walk?" Kairos didn't need to answer. He stepped onto the stone path, paws pressing into the snow, leaving a trail of firm, neat prints, each one a quiet declaration. "I didn't just survive, I am living." They walked around the neighborhood, past balconies draped in lights, past the soft echo of music from a second-floor apartment. Under the twinkle of holiday bulbs, people paused and smiled at the sight of Thorn and Kairos side by side, a pair that needed no caption. A woman at the gate, holding a paper bag, froze when she saw them. She stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Thorn's shoulder. "Thank you, not for the speech, but for letting him be who he truly is." She knelt, brushed her fingers over Kairos's head. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He simply closed his eyes, a silent nod. That night, in the small living room, Kairos lay near the fireplace. Thorn sat nearby, writing in an old leather notebook. He wrote slowly, not a diary, but a message. First Christmas that wasn't cold, because for the first time in years, there was warmth from within, not from lights, but from a heart that still breathes. He set the notebook aside and looked out the window, where snow still fell, but the wind no longer stung. In that quiet glow, Kairos slept soundly, breath steady. No nightmares, no twitching. Just peaceful sleep, the kind a warrior earns once the world finally calls him by the right name. The memorial for Kairos was held in early January, while Christmas lights still blinked and snow had just begun to melt along the grass's edge. It wasn't a grand ceremony. No flags, no rows of officials, just the people who had truly been touched by his story, and who came simply to say thank you. On the lawn, near the bronze statue that had become a spiritual anchor for the whole town, a large wreath stood. Not made of rare flowers, just sunflowers, white daisies, and lavender, woven together by Veldenmoor's residents. Kairos stood at the front with Thorn. He wore a light windbreaker, ears perked, eyes calm and watchful like a gentle gatekeeper. There was no fatigue in him, only the stillness of someone who had walked through darkness and feared nothing now. Then, from the far end of the gravel path, a familiar figure appeared. Marvin, long wool coat, weathered fedora, wooden cane tapping softly against the ground with every step. He paused for a moment when his eyes met Kairos, who had turned to look back. No calling, no startled reaction. Just a gaze, slow and deep, as if two souls were quietly checking if the memories were still there. And then Kairos stepped forward. One step at a time, slower than usual, but without hesitation. Thorn remained still, stepping back just slightly. The crowd fell silent. The space seemed to still entirely, leaving only the sound of Kairos's paw steps on damp earth and the faint rhythm of Marvin's cane tapping directly against the hearts of everyone watching. When they were an arm's length apart, Marvin leaned down. "Well now," he whispered, "still the same eyes, but brighter now." Kairos stepped in and rested his head in Marvin's palm. No whining, no licking, just a quiet touch. Enough to make a man who once slept beneath bridges feel, for the first time, that he had never truly been left behind. Marvin looked up, eyes glistening, not from the cold, but from something deep in his chest that was finally softening. Not sadness, something gentler, something like release. "I didn't lose a friend," he said, voice unsteady. "I just returned a warrior." Thorn stepped forward, nodding silently to Marvin. There was no need for a thank you. In that moment, they all understood. No one owned anyone, no debts owed, no hierarchy claimed. Just three souls, each broken at different points in time, now standing beneath the same sky, sharing breath and memory, and silently exhaling. We are no longer alone. Around the statue, townspeople gathered, each bringing something small, a photo, a handkerchief, a piece of rope, an old tag, all placed gently around the statue's base like fragments of memory. Esri filmed quietly, saying nothing, simply capturing the moment through the amber light of dusk, as the sun spilled gold across Kairos's face like powdered sunlight. A small child walked up to Marvin and took his hand. "Mister, who are you?" Marvin leaned down, patting the child's head with a quiet smile. "I was the one that dog chose to sit beside, back when the world didn't notice anyone." The girl tilted her head. "He chose you?" Marvin looked toward Kairos, then nodded. Not with a voice, with silence. That evening, on the porch, Thorn, Esri, and Marvin sat around a small tea table. Kairos lay by the hearth, resting his head on Esri's leg, something he had never done before. Thorn poured tea and slid a cup toward Marvin. "You planning to stay in Veldenmoor?" Marvin smiled. "I think so. First time in my life I've felt awaited. Not by someone, but by a day when I no longer have to run." Outside, snow began falling again. Thin, gentle, as if the sky itself were listening to a story no one ever expected would end this beautifully. And in that small room, there were no grand lights, no medals on the wall, just a dog, 3 people, and the quiet understanding that when a loyal soul is called by the right name, it no longer needs to be held back. It chooses to stay. Spring came early that year, but the air still carried a trace of the old season's chill. Sunlight filtered through fresh green leaves, casting long beams across the wooden floor of the living room, where Kairos lay still, his head resting on a worn fleece blanket that Thorn had never once washed, just to preserve the faint scent of old medicine. His breathing wasn't steady anymore. His chest no longer rose with the calm rhythm of sleep, but stuttered, slowed, like a song approaching its final note. Yet no one called a doctor. No one rushed in with medicine or an oxygen tank. Because that day, they weren't trying to keep Kairos alive. They were simply there, to stay with him until the very end. Thorn sat close by, his hand wrapped gently around Kairos's paw. Marvin sat beside him, head bowed in silence. Esri placed a cup of warm tea on the table, but didn't drink. The wind drifted in through a crack in the door, bringing the scent of freshly cut grass and steeped tea leaves, a strange, tender calm in the air, like nature itself was whispering a farewell. Kairos didn't move, but his eyes stayed open, barely, fixed on Thorn, where the last light of the day glinted in pupils clouded with age, but never once uncertain. And then, in the softest moment, Kairos raised one paw, gently placing it against Thorn's hand. Not forcefully, not trembling, just a touch, the same way he did years ago in the blood-red dirt of Kasra, when a dog without a name lay wounded beside fallen comrades and still reached out to the soldier who had just saved him, as if to say, "I'm still here." Thorn shivered. He held the paw tighter. "You don't have to keep fighting, Kairos." He leaned down, resting his forehead against Kairos's. "You saved me twice," he whispered, "and both times you never said a word. Now I'll live, in a way that honors that." Kairos took one last breath, a deep one. Then he slipped away, quietly, like the last beam of sunlight giving way to a gentle night. That evening, the people of Veldenmoor brought candles and placed them around the bronze statue. No announcement, no invitation, just a quiet chain of light encircling the still form, like arms wrapping around something unmoving, yet still watching. Marvin was the first to speak. He brought no paper, no speech, just a hand on the statue's shoulder and eyes turned toward the fading sun. He never asked anything, but he answered every question about kindness. The next morning, a new line was added to the Second Flame website. Kairos, code 817-B, K9, Reconnaissance Unit, Kasra Highlands. Born, unknown. Past, Veldenmoor. Record status, complete. Notes, belonged to no one, forgotten by no one. Esri posted the final entry. There are warriors who never ask for medals. They don't speak much, don't object, don't complain. They simply stand there when we need them most. And sometimes what we must do is stand beside them when it's their time to go. A week later, the small plaque beneath Kairos's statue was updated. Marvin's original line remained untouched. But beneath it, another was added, etched at a soft angle, like a whisper left behind. Silent valor. We heard your whisper. And so each afternoon, as sunlight draped Kairos's statue in copper light, people still slowed their steps. They didn't need to hear the whole story. They didn't need the words. They only needed a few seconds, and they would know. A soul had once lived here, and that it had lived fully, not through speech, but through presence. Kairos was not just a German shepherd. He was a symbol of loyalty that needed no oath, a living testament to the strength of silent love, the kind not born of command or instinct, but of a heart that chose to stay, even when no one believed in him. His story makes us question how we treat the lives who walk beside us quietly, protecting us without praise, without conditions. Dogs, especially German Shepherds, are not just brave and intelligent. They carry an astonishing capacity for love, sometimes deeper than what we give to one another. From Kairos, we learn that greatness does not always lie in heroic acts, but in continuing to believe in goodness, even after being abandoned. Every step he took, every gentle touch, was a reminder that loyalty does not require medals. It only asks to be called by its true name. So if you've ever had a four-legged friend, give them an extra touch, a gentler look. Because in that moment, perhaps, just perhaps, there's a Kairos watching over you too, saving you in a way you'll never quite realize. For 10 long years, every trace of the boy named Eli had vanished into thin air, as if he had never existed, until one day, Rex, a German Shepherd once bound by strict training protocols, broke formation without warning and darted into the depths of the forest. From that moment on, secrets long buried beneath layers of silence began to surface, piece by piece, like fragments of a forgotten dream. But what sent shockwaves through the entire town wasn't where Eli fell, but somewhere no one ever imagined he had been taken to. And Rex, could he truly sniff out even the things humans chose to forget? Cedar Hollow awoke beneath a delicate veil of autumn mist, the morning air damp and weightless, draped across the rugged trunks of towering pines, like a breath exhaled by the forest itself. The bark, mottled in muted grays and browns, glistened faintly with dew, as if marked by the fading footprints of something that had passed through without a sound and disappeared into nothingness. Sunlight had not yet pierced the thick canopy above, but faint shafts of gold still filtered through, dappling the lush green moss carpeting the forest floor, where brittle twigs snapped under the hurried feet of a foraging squirrel. The air was cool and impossibly still, so clear it felt suspended in time, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, afraid that the slightest stir might awaken an ancient memory that had never been named. It had been 19 years since that morning, a morning that should have been like any other, but instead fractured a family into two halves that would never again feel whole. Eli Barrett, 13 years old, with copper-colored hair and a smile that burned bright like a flickering campfire, had left the family campsite with a simple promise to go wash his hands in the stream, the last words his mother would ever hear from him. After that, he vanished, as if the forest had swallowed him whole in the softest of gestures. No struggle, no sound, no sign of return. The search stretched on for 2 weeks. Search and rescue teams, scent tracking dogs, helicopters slicing through the tree cover, and volunteers from every corner of Marlow Creek gathered in the woods, calling out Eli's name through radios, into the night, and into the desperate prayers whispered by those whose legs had long since given out. But he never answered. Not a scrap of clothing, not a single clear footprint, only a handkerchief, found near the stream, wind-blown and dusted with faint traces of ash, the one and only clue, heart-breakingly thin. Eli became something else entirely, no longer just a name, but a shadow, suspended somewhere between the real and the imagined, between hope and despair, a memory that haunted anyone who had ever stepped into those woods and paused just to hear the brutal silence of where a child once had been. This morning, on the same forest floor, Clara Monroe zipped her jacket all the way up, tucking her chin beneath the thick, soft collar as she turned around, her gaze drifting to the tactical truck parked near the edge of the training zone. A breeze caught her hair, carrying with it the sharp, resinous scent of pine and damp wood. the unmistakable perfume of Cedar Hollow in late October. She had never fully gotten used to the mountain cold of Oregon, but mornings like these, when sunlight flickered shyly through the trees and every sound was softened by mist, made her feel as if she stood at the fragile line between what was and what might still be, a place where even the smallest movement could awaken something that had lain dormant for decades. Beside her sat Rex, the German shepherd, whose thick black and gray coat glowed faintly like a coal yet to go cold. His ears, perpetually alert, stood like sentinels, and his eyes, intelligent to an almost unsettling degree, were locked onto Clara's every gesture. They had been partners for 2 years now, not perfect, but deeply in tune, one learning to hear the weight of silence, the other following instinct alone. Rex had once trained for military search and rescue, but was deemed too independent for strict obedience, and nearly pulled from the program. Clara, then fresh out of training herself, had taken Rex on as a challenge, never expecting the bond would shape the course of her life. She patted him gently on the neck, just above the dark leash clipped tight to a steel collar. "Just a training session today, remember, buddy?" she said softly, her voice low and steady, not like someone giving commands to a dog, but as if speaking to a trusted partner. Rex tilted his head slightly. He didn't bark or flinch, but there was something in his eyes that changed, deepened like a current beneath still water. It wasn't eagerness like other mornings, but something focused, alert, as if the forest had just whispered something only Rex could hear. A sharp whistle cut through the mist from the training station. One short burst. Clara gave the leash a small tug, straightened up, and began walking with Rex into the trembling grove of pines that shivered gently under the morning wind. Dry leaves rustled underfoot, and the wind, sliding between the trees, made a sound that felt like breath brushing against skin. In that moment, no one, not even Clara, could have known that this seemingly routine morning was about to become something else entirely. Somewhere nearby, not far from the designated training area, a shallow pit lay hidden beneath layers of rotting leaves, and from it a scent rose, faint, ancient, but to Rex, it carried the unmistakable weight of something that had never rested in peace. He stopped in his tracks. His ears twitched, his nose lifted, his eyes turned toward the edge of the forest, where the fog was thickening into a wall of white. Clara didn't have time to speak. She only felt the cold whisper of air brush her neck. And then Rex began to move, slow and deliberate, veering off the trail, waiting for no command. A single leaf drifted down in front of Clara's boots, landing without a sound, like a sign. She tightened her grip on the leash but didn't pull back. Instead, she whispered to herself, as if saying it out loud made it real. "We're going somewhere, aren't we, Rex?" And together they stepped off the marked path, heading toward a part of the forest no one from the training unit ever chose, an area labeled with 3 faded crimson letters on a map worn soft with age. Restricted zone. There were no warning signs, no barriers, but everyone who'd worked long enough in Cedar Hollow's search team knew. Some places didn't need signs. It wasn't danger in the usual sense, but something else. Something that made people's skin prickle and their voices drop, as though time itself had failed to scrub clean whatever had happened there. Rex pushed through the underbrush without hesitation, each step sure but measured, his nose skimming close to the earth, tail stiff, ears scanning every faint shift in the wind, as if even the smallest rustle might carry a clue. Clara followed closely, gripping the leash, her pulse starting to quicken, not from fear, but from the strange pull of instinct rising inside her, as if she too was following a scent, a memory that had long slept deep within her mind, unnamed and untouched. And so they walked, not toward danger, but into the echo of something unfinished. "Monroe!" A voice, sharp as a blade, sliced through the stillness from behind, reverberating in the cold, dry air of the deep forest. Clara froze for half a second, just long enough to recognize the voice of Officer Mallory, the commanding presence leading today's training session, and the man known just as much for his rigid doctrine as for his belief that discipline matters more than achievement. "Bring the dog back, immediately." She turned, locking eyes with Mallory as he approached, his face chiseled like mountain stone, his pale blue eyes drained of emotion, leaving only the icy glint of authority and the habit of command. Behind him trailed a few other officers, fumbling with GPS readouts, while the emergency light on the device in Mallory's hand blinked red, a warning from the tracking system. Team 04 has exited the designated training zone. Clara wanted to speak, to say that Rex never acted without cause, that there had been something in the dog's eyes and posture she had never seen before. Not recklessness, but guidance, a certainty, as if he were following a signal only he could perceive. But her throat closed up. Logic urged compliance, warned her not to make a scene. Yet something deeper, a whisper from the heart, urged her to trust her instincts, to trust Rex. Rex hadn't looked back once. He continued onward, each step steady yet growing more urgent, as though the scent he was tracking, that invisible thread calling him forward, was fading, and he had to reach its source before it vanished forever. "Monroe!" Mallory barked again, closer now, his voice rising with anger. "If you take one more step, you're out of this training program, permanently." Clara turned to look at him. The distance between her and Rex was widening. A choice had to be made, not between right and wrong, but between belief and fear, between duty and instinct. And then, just as the world held its breath, a sound slipped through the trees, barely audible, like the wind brushing against a single branch, or perhaps the earth exhaling after a long, buried sigh. Rex halted abruptly, stood still for a moment, then turned back toward Clara. He didn't bark. He didn't tug the leash. But in his eyes, there was no uncertainty, only a message clearer than words. "Follow me, trust me. We're about to find something." Clara tightened her grip on the lead. She didn't look back. Her voice came low, steady, not an apology, not an excuse, just the truth. "If there's punishment later, I'll accept it. But today, I'm going with him." And she stepped after Rex, pushing through brittle branches, brushing aside damp fronds of fern, slipping into the part of the forest where the fog thickened like a curtain drawn across time itself. Each step they took felt like a descent, not just deeper into the woods, but into something older, quieter, layered with the kind of silence that swallows sound and memory alike beneath moss-covered roots. A small deer crossed their path in the distance, its wide eyes reflecting the filtered light, part gold, part gray, as if the mist itself were watching them. Rex paused again, nose close to the ground, then suddenly veered left, vanishing through a tangle of low shrubs. "Rex!" Clara called, a sharp breath rather than a cry, and darted after him. Her foot caught on a root, nearly sending her sprawling, but she caught her balance just in time. Around her, all other sounds seemed to dim. Mallory's voice, the warning horn, even her own breath, receding into a quiet so complete it felt sacred. And then, just beyond a ridge draped in lichen and veiled in fog, she saw him. Rex stood motionless in a small clearing. The earth there sunken, blanketed in leaves, but not like the rest of the forest floor. There was something in the air itself, a weight, a hush, as if the forest too was holding its breath. Rex didn't bark, didn't move. He just stood there, trembling slightly, eyes fixed on a single point in the ground, as though beneath the soil a whisper had begun to rise, faint but real. Clara slowed her steps, saying nothing, urging nothing. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her eyes following his. Between the damp leaves and tangled roots, something broke the uniformity, a color, a texture out of place. A fragment of fabric darkened by time, frayed but still bearing the ghost of a stitched seam. Rex whined softly, not out of fear, but as if urging her closer, saying without words, "We're not wrong. This is the place." And in the mist curling up from the ground like memory-given form, Clara caught a scent unlike any she'd encountered in training. Not antiseptic, not synthetic, but something ancient, faintly ashen, like the breath of a fire long since smothered beneath years of silence. She drew a deep breath, reached forward, and began to brush the leaves away. The wind shifted. Above them, a flock of crows erupted into motion, and from beneath the stirred earth, a soft clink broke the stillness, the sound of metal striking stone. Clara looked up at Rex. His eyes hadn't moved from the ground, but this time a flicker of light danced within them, as if something buried had reflected back the sun's first beam after years of darkness. Rex began to dig, no longer tentative, but with fierce purpose. Each strike of his paws tore through decayed roots and soft earth, sending plumes of loam swirling like smoke, mingling with the mist still rising from the rain-soaked forest floor. With every scoop, the ground shifted, revealing not just soil, but something older, a story long hidden, awakened by the pressure of Paws and the insistence of memory. Clara leaned closer, eyes fixed on the patch he uncovered. The color of the earth there had changed, deepened, grown rich with something that wasn't just age, but meaning, the scent of time and ash. And then, through the web of twisted roots and soaked mulch, something emerged, uneven, indistinct, but unmistakable. A shard of bone, ivory-hued and delicate, curved and pale, jutting from the soil like a remnant of breath held too long. A fragment of human finger, broken and caked in mud, yet still bearing the fragile line of what once was touch. Clara froze. Her heartbeat faltered, then surged with the rhythm of ancient drums. A whisper rose in her chest, barely a breath, not addressed to anyone, but echoing in her mind like a bell that had waited decades to ring. Eli. She didn't dare touch it. Her fingers, trembling yet precise, reached into her coat pocket to retrieve the radio, her eyes never once leaving the small fragment of bone on the forest floor. And when her voice finally broke through the static, carried across the channel like a signal from another world, it sounded steadier than the storm twisting silently within her chest. "This is the K-9 unit, confirming coordinates at the edge of Sector 4B. We've discovered partial human remains, requesting immediate dispatch of forensics and perimeter lockdown. Priority level, high." Rex sat down beside her, still as a shadow cast at noon, neither barking nor twitching, only watching Clara's every move with a gaze that somehow seemed to grasp just how heavy and irreversible this moment really was. The wind stirred the canopy above, and the leaves rustled like pages turning in an old book, each whisper of sound peeling back a layer of time, each breath a memory being summoned back into the light. 12 minutes later, the first patrol SUV came barreling through the fog. A white Marlow Creek police vehicle, lights swirling red and blue across the damp morning haze, its tires crushing the wet leaf bed beneath with the weight of final punctuation pressed into the past. Sergeant Keller was the first to step out, tall, lean, hair salt and pepper, a former firefighter turned police veteran. His lined face momentarily softened when his eyes met Clara's. He moved quickly but without panic, gaze falling not on her, but on the makeshift cloth flag Clara had stuck into the earth beside the bone to mark the scene. "It's human," Clara said quietly, her voice dropping low. "And it hasn't been here just a few years. It might be much longer." Keller crouched, studied the find, then nodded in silence. With the flick of a hand, he signaled 2 officers to begin cordoning off the area with tape, clearing underbrush to prepare forensics to work unimpeded. Then he pulled out his phone, calmly but efficiently calling in a metal detector unit, a pop-up tent for weather cover, and access to archived missing persons records. "This spot here," he murmured while jotting in his field notebook. "This used to be right along the edge of the old Barrett family campsite, didn't it?" Clara simply nodded. No words were necessary. In that moment, silence bore more truth than speech ever could. And Rex, as if to affirm the gravity of it all, stretched his nose forward to sniff the air once more, then began circling the shallow depression. Not like a dog who'd finished a job, but like one who knew this was only the beginning. By the time the forensics team arrived, Clara had already stepped back, standing quietly next to Rex while gloved hands lowered tools into the soil, extracting earth one layer at a time. Each scoop of dirt scraped into the open air felt like a pulse pounding in Clara's chest, not from fear, but from the awful knowing that after this day, silence would no longer be able to guard what it once buried. Then came a scrap of fabric, moss green, patterned with faint plaid lines, eerily similar to the kind of flannel shirts teenage boys favored in the late 80s. Next, a loose button with grooves still intact, a brittle piece of leather belt, and finally, something that made the air itself seem to freeze, a rectangular plastic card, scratched almost beyond recognition, its edges warped by time, but still faintly legible in one corner, where the words Barrett Middle School could be made out. Clara didn't speak. She didn't move. Her mind filled with a photograph she had once seen in the old case file. A boy named Eli Barrett, eyes bright, a plaid shirt on his shoulders, and a pale blue student ID clipped to his chest. A breeze brushed past her cheek, cutting deep, but it was the soft touch of Rex's paw against her knee that kept her grounded. A silent reminder. Not yet. Not now. Keller turned toward her, his expression thoughtful, layered with something more than just duty. "We're going to reopen everything from 1989. Are you absolutely sure you want to stay in this?" Clara didn't answer. She simply laid a hand gently on Rex's head, the only partner who had led her here, and gazed into the disturbed earth before them, the dirt churned up by the relentless will of a creature who had never once turned back. From the edges of the cordoned site, a few townsfolk had begun to gather, scattered among the moss-covered trunks, just out of reach, like ghosts summoned by the memory of a town refusing to forget. One woman, her sweater faded, and hands gripping a wrinkled photo, said nothing. She simply stood there and watched. And then, in a brief second that no one saw coming, a shaft of late afternoon sunlight sliced through the canopy, slipped past the mist, and landed directly on the bone fragment Rex had uncovered. A thread-thin beam, but sharp, almost blinding, catching the surface of the exposed bone and scattering light like a quiet revelation. It glinted, not like evidence, but like confession, as if the earth had held onto this secret long enough. And now it was ready to speak. The bone was rushed to the nuclear forensic lab in Lincoln County. They didn't need much. No lengthy procedure, no dramatic twists. A single DNA test drawn from the residual marrow in the humerus was enough. A near-perfect match. The remains belonged to a male adolescent, aged between 12 and 14, whose genetic profile aligned precisely with a hospital file preserved decades earlier, a dried blood sample taken from Eli Barrett during an arm fracture at age 8. And there, stamped clearly across the first clinical confirmation report, was the name, Eli Jonah Barrett. Clara stood by the observation window of the examination room, the weight of the report in her hands heavier than steel, while the cold fluorescence above reflected on the ash-gray floor tiles. And there, in the broken silhouette beneath her feet, she could see herself split in two. one half a law officer still clinging to her protocols. The other, a person slowly being drawn into a story that was no longer a case file, but a fate, one guided by the silent determination of a dog who had never forgotten. That afternoon, Clara drove back to the town of Marlow Creek. A light rain had begun to fall, the droplets thin as thread weaving across the windshield, sketching 1,000 diagonal streaks like scratches drawn by time. She didn't play music. She didn't make a single call. She let the cabin remain suspended in utter stillness, filled only with the sound of rain, the rhythmic sweep of the wipers, and the solemn, steady thump of her own heart. The house at the end of Willow Lane, where Judith Barrett lived, stood quietly in the mist. A modest, white-paneled home with paint peeling in corners, but somehow still remarkably tidy, with windows that gleamed, flower pots hanging in neat rows from the porch rail, and a small wooden sign near the door, handwritten with the words, "Welcome, please knock gently." Clara didn't need to knock. The moment her foot touched the creaking wooden step, the door opened, as if it had been waiting. There stood Judith, her hair silver and softly curled, her frame small and aged, but her eyes still burning with a strange, unwavering brightness. A damp, crumpled handkerchief clenched in her hand, as though she had already known who was coming and, more importantly, why. "It's him, isn't it?" Her voice was husky, brittle, and she didn't wait for confirmation. Clara nodded just slightly. And in that quiet moment there was no sobbing, no collapse into grief, only the sound of a single sigh slipping from parted lips, the kind of sigh that feels less like breath and more like the release of a stone that's been carried across a decade, a burden worn so long that its weight had almost become invisible. They sat together in the small kitchen, where the fireplace still glowed softly with fading embers. On the wooden table, a cup of tea sat untouched, next to a photo album left open, the page showing Eli standing beside an old bicycle, wearing a green checkered shirt, his smile tilted just enough to catch the light like sun filtering through trees. "I buried him," Judith whispered, her fingers trembling as they brushed the image. "Not to forget him, but to keep him whole. The way he was, not the thing the forest gave back." Clara said nothing, only listened. Not like listening to words, but like surrendering to a melody composed entirely of memory. Then Judith looked up, her eyes meeting Clara's, and for the first time, they held a fragile shard of light. "Did you bring him? The dog?" "Rex is waiting outside," Clara replied gently. "I think he still senses something, like he isn't ready to leave the forest yet." Judith rose, stepping toward the porch. Clara followed, and there, beneath the sloping wooden eaves, the two women, one who had lost a child and one still searching for answers, stood side by side in the drizzle, watching as Rex sat quietly under the old maple, the rain soft on his back, his eyes fixed on a distant stretch of trees that for Clara held nothing more to find. But for Rex, the journey was still unfolding. Clara crouched beside him, placed a hand on his neck, and murmured as one might to an old friend, "What do you see? What's still there that I can't?" Rex let out the faintest whine, lifting his nose into the air, drawing in something that seemed less like scent and more like a fading thread of memory caught in the rain. And then, without warning, he rose, turning north, not back toward the original site, but toward the far edge of the forest, the one untouched since the search ended all those years ago. "You smell something else now, don't you, my friend?" Clara asked softly. But this time, Rex didn't wait for her words. He began to move, slow but certain, each step seeming to follow the pull of some invisible tether stretched tight beneath the earth. Judith watched, silent. But when Clara turned toward her, their eyes met, and what she saw was no longer the gaze of a mother receiving news of death, but of someone who had just begun to understand that part of the truth still refused to surface from the cold soil. Clara caught up with Rex, her hand finding the leash not to control, but to stay connected, because it was clear now. She wasn't leading him. She was being led. The rain thickened, but light still filtered through the clouds with a soft golden hue, as if the late afternoon sky itself had taken their hands, guiding both woman and beast toward the horizon that had not yet closed. And when they reached the forest's edge, where once there had been a dirt road now consumed by grass and silence, Rex stopped, still as stone. He neither barked nor tugged, only stared at a low bush in the distance, where the wind had just passed, carrying with it a strange scent, faint, indistinct, but stubborn, and more than anything else, human. Clara's fingers tightened on the leash, then slowly let go. Rex did not turn. In that moment the world seemed to pause, the forest itself holding breath, every sound retreating, every shadow leaning toward that same fixed point. The fading sunlight lay in streaks across the mossy floor, casting pale golden lines between the trees, and the breeze, once soft and passing, coiled into a small whirl as it danced through the bush, revealing behind it the fresh impression of a human footprint, still wet on the soil, not yet dry. Clara narrowed her eyes, stepped forward, and signaled Rex to stay. He obeyed without hesitation, lying down, his head still pointed forward. As Clara circled the bush, no one was there, but the trail of footprints continued, winding down a shallow incline toward the fields beyond the woods, the very fields that, 10 years ago, had once bordered a road leading back to the town's old high school. Now just a sea of waist-high wild grass. That evening, it was nearly 10 when Clara returned to the station. The hallway was cloaked in a dull yellow glow from the flickering lights above, their reflections casting warped shadows along the floor tiles. The silence inside so complete, it felt reverent, until she opened the break room door. There, in the muted light and the lingering scent of stale coffee, a young man sat slouched in the leather chair opposite the desk. Head bowed, hands locked tightly, his gaze sunken, as if holding on to a memory that kept slipping through his fingers. The old leather jacket, the muddy boots, the uncombed brown hair. Nothing about him felt familiar. And yet, when Clara stepped into the doorway, he looked up. And for a heartbeat, just one, she recognized those eyes. No name tag, no introduction. She had seen them before, in a photograph pinned to the back corner of the town's library wall, in a newspaper clipping yellowed by time, and in the haunted stories of those who once searched for a boy who vanished in 1989. Dean Whitmore. He said nothing at first, not because he had no words, but because silence had been his shelter for too long. And now, speech arrived like a child taking its first uncertain steps. I knew. I had to come back. His voice was low, broken, the kind that fractures in places no one expects. Clara sat across from him, asking nothing, only meeting his gaze, the same way she had always done with those witnesses who weren't yet sure they wanted to remember. Dean didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he raised a hand to his forehead in a motion so worn, so automatic, it felt like it had been repeated 1,000 times over the years, a gesture not meant to erase pain, but simply to survive its weight. I left this place when I was 14, he began, his voice caught somewhere between confession and exhaustion. Right after that night, after Eli disappeared, people thought I transferred schools, moved away. But the truth is, I ran. I left everything behind. He looked up then, and for the first time, his eyes locked with Clara's, and what she saw in them was not surprise, but a dense, lingering remorse, the kind that hardens over time into something sharp and unspoken, layered with a kind of fear that hadn't yet found its name. Because I was there. I was the last person who saw Eli alive. The words didn't shock Clara. If anything, they only confirmed what her instincts had whispered since the first time she reopened the old case file, that out of the 3 boys who went camping that night, only one returned with his story left unfinished. And that boy was Dean. "What happened?" Clara asked, her tone soft but firm, devoid of pressure but offering no escape. Dean swallowed, hard, and when he spoke again, it was not like someone confessing a crime, but like a man finally laying down the weight of a secret carried too long. That night, it had been the 3 of them, Eli, Dean, and Travis, the eldest son of William Grant, who was then the town's mayor. The camping trip was supposed to be just an exercise in independence, a harmless venture into the woods. But what no one foresaw was how, under the veil of night, the smallest tensions between children could bloom into something darker, something fed by fear, by silence, by the confusing turbulence of youth that adults never fully understand. That night, between the crackling fire and the hush of wind moving through the trees, Eli had said something that lit a fire in Travis. An argument followed, tense and heated, near the edge of the creek. Dean couldn't remember the exact words, or maybe he didn't want to. But he did remember seeing Eli stumble, losing his footing, falling. And then, the panic. "We ran," Dean said. "We didn't call anyone. We didn't go back." Clara didn't take notes. She didn't need to. She just nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving Dean's face, as if searching for the truth, not in his words, but in the fractures between them. "And after that," Dean went on, his voice quieter now, "everything was buried. Travis' family had lawyers, influence. I was sent to live with my aunt in another state. They told me, the less I said, the better." "Then why come back?" Clara asked. Dean turned towards the window, where the curtain danced in the night breeze like a ghost exhaling softly. "Because last night I dreamed of Eli," he said. He was standing in the forest, soaked to the bone, shivering, but not angry. He looked at me. Then he turned away and walked toward a light in the trees. When I woke up, I just knew it was time. The room held its breath. The light from the single fluorescent tube above the desk flickered faintly, casting Dean's shadow onto the floor, a trembling silhouette that looked like the shape of a child shivering in memory. "There's one more thing," Dean said, almost to himself, "something I've never told anyone." Right before Eli walked toward the creek, he grabbed my hand, tight. He said, "If anything happens, remember that spot, the one with the 3 trees growing together. I hid something there, something important. But when I came back, I couldn't find them. I never saw those trees again." A sudden chill spread down Clara's spine, not from fear, but from recognition, because on the GPS mapping she and Rex had reviewed just hours earlier, right near the thicket where Rex had stopped cold, there were 3 ancient maple trees growing side by side, their roots intertwined in a shape like a shallow bowl, and at its center, a small, sunken patch of earth. That night, as Clara returned home, Rex didn't sleep. He lay by the window, head resting on his paws, eyes still open, ears turned toward the forest, as if he too knew that something was still waiting, just beyond the reach of the known. And the next morning, before the sun had even lifted itself above the mountains, a call from forensics roused Clara from bed. "We've recovered another item, about 70 meters from the original site. It was buried in a shallow depression near the 3 trees. A small leather-bound notebook, water-damaged but still legible. The cover, it has initials scrawled in blue ink. EJB." Clara rose without hesitation. pulling on her coat and stepping out onto the porch where Rex was already sitting, as if he'd been waiting all night, sensing that the forest was about to whisper its final truth, the missing piece of a puzzle that had long defied completion. The light of dawn was faint and gentle, casting a muted orange glow across the dew-soaked ground, like the soft skin of hope peeling slowly away from the night. She drove straight to the site. The forensic team had already set up a temporary tent beside the 3 maple trees, where the ground sloped into a cradle of earth that felt ancient, sacred. Dry roots stretched out from the trunks like skeletal fingers, curled protectively around whatever had once been entrusted to the soil. Inside a sealed glass box, carefully handled and preserved, lay the leather notebook. Beside it, a dark red handkerchief, stained with blood long dried into deep brown blotches. Rex was the first to react. He moved forward with slow precision, not barking, not rushing, just tilting his head and drawing in a deep breath, then turning to look at Clara with eyes that seemed to carry a message from the ground itself. Clara crouched down, letting her gaze follow Rex's. She lifted the handkerchief with careful fingers. Even through the wrinkles and age, the stitching was still visible. A red and white checkered pattern, the kind that had once filled shelves at teen clothing stores in this part of the country in the late 1980s. The blood no longer had a scent, but one of the smudges had soaked in such a way that it left the imprint of 5 tiny fingertips, as if a small hand had gripped it tight, pressing it hard against a wound. 2 hours later, the lab in Salem sent back the results. The blood on the cloth matched Eli's DNA with absolute certainty. No statistical margin, no possibility of error. It was his. The same boy who, according to his mother Judith, always carried a fabric handkerchief in his pocket because, in her words, he hated paper towels, only liked soft cloth. Clara sat alone in her car. The report rested neatly on her lap, printed in black ink on white paper, but her eyes were fixed on the windshield, where a mist still clung to the glass like a veil. She stared into the stillness beyond, the forest, unmoving, silent, and deep, like the eyes of someone who carries words they've never spoken. She didn't read another word. She didn't need to. Every line in that report only confirmed what her heart already knew, what Rex had sensed without fail. This was never just a disappearance, and it was no accident. Not anymore. The story, like a long-forgotten photograph emerging slowly in the liquid of a darkroom, was beginning to reveal its fractures, details that refused to align, silences that could no longer be filled with time, and gaps that stretched wider the more they were ignored. Clara found herself returning again and again to what Dean had confessed the night before, about Eli, about the argument, but most of all, about the strange final words Eli had spoken before walking away. "If anything happens, remember the place with the 3 trees." And as if sensing her hesitation, Rex shifted closer, resting his chin gently on her thigh in a gesture that was both comfort and insistence, his amber-flecked eyes gazing up at her with a depth that surpassed instinct, surpassing the training that had shaped him. As though in that moment, he wasn't a dog, not merely a companion, but a quiet witness to a soul still crying out for justice through the veil of the forgotten. Clara laid a hand on his head, her touch light as a vow, then opened the car door and stepped out, following Rex across the short stretch of gravel and grass toward the edge of the woods, where the low shrubs swayed gently in the early wind. The air here was cooler, denser, thick with the scent of damp moss and untamed weeds, but beneath it, faint, almost hidden, there was something else. A sharp, metallic tang, subtle but unmistakable, like the trace of blood caught in a gust of dry leaves. Rex inhaled deeply, then lunged forward, not toward the known path, not back toward the marked scene, but into a part of the forest untouched for years, veering toward that darker, denser stretch where no recent footprints had dared press. Clara followed without pause. The dog did not run fast, but each of his steps was measured, deliberate, as if the very earth beneath his paws were sacred, as if every inch concealed a memory, buried but waiting. And then, in a clearing between two decaying tree trunks, Rex stopped. He pressed his nose to the ground, pulled back slightly, then began to dig. The soil here was unusually soft, disturbed in a way that suggested it had once been broken and smoothed over again. Clara knelt beside him, brushing away the layer of decomposing leaves. And there, nestled just beneath the surface, something caught the light. A small, rusted metal object, circular, with a hole in the center, the kind meant for threading onto a chain. She rinsed it with a splash of water from her bottle, and slowly, through the grime, the words began to emerge. Trust me. TG. Clara stood motionless. Those final initials, TG, matched the name of Travis Grant, the mayor's son at the time of the disappearance. A keychain, custom-made, the kind passed around at summer camps as a symbol of belonging, shared only among tight-knit friends, the kind that means nothing to outsiders, but everything to the ones who carry it. She looked to Rex. He wasn't digging anymore. He simply stood, tail swaying slowly, ears perked as if listening, not to a sound, but to a memory, to some distant echo of truth leaking through the fractures of an unfinished story. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above, striping Clara's shoulder with thin bands of gold, illuminating the slow drift of fine dust in the air, particles suspended between reality and recollection, between what had happened and what had been told. Her fingers closed around the rusted token, the simple object now resting in her coat pocket like a secret too heavy for its size, carrying the weight of a confession buried for over a decade. Clara knew where to begin. Ben Calloway, the least mentioned of the three boys, the one whose name didn't carry the weight of a legacy, the quiet one, the one described in school reports as shy, suggestible, the kind who drifted in the wake of stronger wills. He now lived in a small town 3 hours from Marlow Creek, fixing cars at a roadside garage, a life deliberately small, as if he had spent every year since trying to stay below the surface of someone else's memory. When Clara found him, Ben fumbled with his hands, wiped them on a rag, pulled out a chair, every movement betraying the unrest beneath his skin. He didn't deny anything, but he didn't volunteer the truth either. His words came in fragments, but Clara, attuned to the pauses more than the words, sensed the avalanche of unspoken things pressing just behind every silence. "You're asking about Eli," he began, voice low, fingers tightly knotted. "He didn't deserve to die. He didn't deserve to be left there like that." "Then why didn't you say anything?" "For 10 years?" Clara asked, not as an accusation, but like someone holding up a torn map and begging for just one thread to stitch the path back together. Ben looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. "Because I was scared," he whispered. "Of Travis, of his father, of what they could do to my mom, to me. They had lawyers, they had people in the system, they had ways of making things disappear. And me, I was just some kid who didn't know which side I owed loyalty to." Clara didn't speak. Her hand rested on the table, steady, holding his gaze without pressure. A silence not of judgment, but of invitation, like a door left open in a storm. And Ben began to speak. That night, after their campfire dinner, Eli had said he wanted to leave early, said he felt uneasy, like something about the whole trip had started to feel wrong. Travis had laughed, called him a soft city boy, then thrown a cup of water in his face. Eli stood, knocked Travis's hand away, not violently, just enough to startle. But that small defiance triggered something, Travis shoved him. Eli stumbled, fell fast, too fast. His head struck a root. The sound was quiet. No scream. No cry. "Everything after that," Ben whispered, "felt like someone hit mute on the world." We just stared. No one yelled. Travis panicked. He said, "No one can ever know. We'll say he left, that's all." And I didn't have the guts to say no. Clara recorded the statement, but her eyes had long drifted from the screen. Her mind was tracing the shape of a truth slowly coming into focus. Not sharp, but formed enough to see that this had never been a simple accident. This was a chain of actions, of choices layered in fear, in power, in silences too long enforced. Next, she went to see Travis Grant. Now the CEO of a major real estate firm, living in a sleek, glass-walled house outside Portland, a man protected by money, position, and the polish of someone raised in a world where words could be bought, where stories could be buried in concrete and contracts. They met in his office, high ceilings, panoramic glass looking out over a man-made lake, pale light rippling against the ceiling. "You're here about all that?" he said, reclining in his chair with the practiced indifference of someone long used to outrunning consequences. "It's been years. I thought it was all put to rest." "Nothing rests," Clara said quietly, "until it's spoken properly." He didn't react, didn't speak, didn't lift his eyes, only kept flipping the pen between his fingers, slow and steady like someone stalling for time, clinging to the last seconds of control. But when Clara placed the rusted keychain on the table in front of him, the one with the words, "Trust me," TG etched faintly into the metal, the faint smile on his lips slowly faded. "I thought I lost that years ago," Travis said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Or maybe," Clara replied, voice level and unwavering, "you buried it." No answer came. Only a flicker in his eyes, subtle but unmistakable, the confident veneer peeling away like early morning fog under the heat of a rising sun. And yet Travis neither confessed nor denied. His response was silence, drawn out just long enough to carry weight, to become a kind of truth in itself. Clara returned to the station as dusk settled over Marlow Creek. Rex met her in the hallway, lifting his head with the quiet urgency of a question he didn't need to voice. A gaze that asked simply, "Are we close?" She bent down, her hand resting on the top of his head. "We're close, my friend. Very close." Outside, the day still held on to its light, though barely, the last golden breath of sun spreading across the clouds, dissolving into pale orange and soft gold, as fragile and beautiful as the end of a dream that lingered on the edge of waking. Clara pulled up her recorder and played Ben's interview again. She had already listened to the beginning several times, but now she let it run all the way to the end. And this time, she caught something she hadn't before. Ben's voice, shaky but clear. "Eli tried to say something, right before he passed out. He kept whispering. The old man across the creek. I didn't understand it, there was no one there. But he said it again. They won't let him talk, be careful, near the white tent." Clara looked up slowly, her eyes drifting to the old campsite map spread out across the back wall. In the lower corner, barely visible, just past the edge of the last search zone, was a small square marked in faded ink. Shelter number 3. Medical Reserve. She placed a fingertip on it, tracing the outline gently, feeling the coarse texture of the yellowed paper, as if trying to follow the pulse of something long buried beneath the surface of this quiet town. Shelter number 3. A name so simple, and yet, in the entire case file on Eli's disappearance, not once had that building ever been mentioned. As though it had been deliberately removed, erased from memory, swallowed whole by the silence that had gripped this place for over a decade, The next morning, as Clara entered her office, Sergeant Keller was already there, standing by her desk with a thick envelope in hand, the uncertainty in his eyes betraying the weight of what he was about to deliver. He laid it down without flourish, his voice low but heavy as stone. "Orders from above. They want the investigation shut down." Clara didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't need to. Her eyes locked on Keller's, a man who had worn his uniform through years of storms, and yet now looked like he was watching one gather just beyond the window. "Who sent it?" she asked. Keller didn't speak right away. He sat down, fingers tapping softly against the table, as if the rhythm might soften the blow. "It came from the Federal Coordination Office," he said. "Directly. But you and I both know this isn't just coming from Washington." Clara understood. She didn't need a name, because in this town, only one man wielded enough influence to stop an investigation with a few stamped letters and a handful of phone calls. William Grant, state senator, former mayor of Marlow Creek, and father of Travis. A man rarely seen in headlines, yet always surrounded by the kind of invisible armor money and politics buy, the kind built not in speeches but in back rooms and golf courses, where truths are buried deeper than bones. And Clara knew, if she chose to move forward from here, she would no longer be searching for the truth. She'd be stepping into the place where truth was something people buried. That afternoon, she and Rex made their way toward the area surrounding Shelter Number 3. The forest there was denser, darker, its trees packed tight like sentries guarding something forgotten. Light barely slipped through. The air carried the damp, moldy scent of rotting grass. A smell like basements left sealed too long, like something sacred and forbidden wrapped in nature's stillness. The old map provided direction, but it was Rex's instinct that truly led the way, his nose skimmed low, his steps deliberate, unshakable, as if each paw landed on a path only he could smell. One laid out years before, waiting just for this moment. Shelter Number 3 revealed itself like a ghost pulled from a half-forgotten dream. Rusted tin roof, one wooden door slumped off its hinges, white paint peeling to reveal the gray skeleton beneath. Vines covered the windows like veils, but within, Clara could sense it. Not the presence of someone, but the weight of something left behind. A moment sealed in silence, too long ignored. Rex paused at the edge of the sagging step, his nose brushing the moss-covered ground before suddenly crouching, front legs bent low as he began to dig. Earth gave way quickly beneath his paws. Within minutes, something metallic gleamed under the surface. Clara knelt, gently brushing away the dirt with a cloth until the object took shape. A brass flip lighter, tarnished with age, but still legible underneath, where a name had once been etched in the finest line. W.G. Clara turned it over slowly in her hand, her chest tightening. William Grant. This wasn't something accidentally dropped. The distance from the main campsite, the proximity to Shelter Number 3, and the depth at which it had been buried made one thing clear. Someone had hidden this, buried it so deep it would never have been found without Rex. She sealed the lighter in an evidence bag and looked toward her companion. Rex remained motionless, his eyes fixed beyond the trees, ears lifted, as if still listening, still waiting, as if the forest had not finished speaking. On her way back into town, Clara's phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, articulate, but edged with that certain kind of coldness that only comes from those too accustomed to power. "I hear you've taken quite the interest in this case, Officer Monroe." "Who is this?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "I was one of the people who helped fund the construction of that camp," he said, voice steady and measured, like a man who had rehearsed the sentence 1,000 times in silence, before allowing it to reach the air. And I'm also someone who believes some things are better left undisturbed, left exactly as they were intended. Clara gave a small smile, not out of amusement, but because something in that moment settled into place without the need for evidence, without the need for proof, like the quiet confirmation of a suspicion finally made solid by absence, not presence. "I found your lighter," she said, her voice low, but each word sharp and deliberate, like the blade of a scalpel, not loud but impossible to ignore. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but enough to register as calculation. Then came the reply, smooth as oil but laced with steel beneath the surface. "Then I suggest you keep it safe. Some things, if mishandled, have a tendency to catch fire." The line went dead. No overt threat, no official warning. But Clara knew, from that moment forward, every step she took would be shadowed by a man who had long since learned to manipulate entire systems with nothing more than silence and a business card. That night, Clara sat in her office, the lighter placed carefully on the desk in front of her, its dull brass surface catching the pale glow of her desk lamp. The tiny scratches along its edge glinting like etchings left by time itself. Rex lay curled beside her, head resting on her foot, his breathing slow and even, but every so often his ears twitched as though even in sleep some part of him remained alert, still tracing the outline of something unseen. Clara opened the old file again, the one yellowed with age, brittle at the corners, filled with documents that had been touched by too many hands but understood by none. Between the faded pages, she found a sheet that had been violently crossed out, the ink smeared as though someone had tried not only to redact it, but to erase the memory of its contents altogether. She pulled out a magnifying lens, examining the faint strokes hidden beneath the overlaid gray, and slowly the words began to emerge, not fully, not cleanly, but enough. "Transfer the boy." Beneath it, a single dash, and next to it, a small post-it note with 4 digits scrawled in uneven handwriting. 27. Clara frowned, placing the file back on the table, her mind beginning to churn, gears shifting as the seemingly disjointed fragments began to inch toward each other, like puzzle pieces drawn by the gravity of truth. The code didn't match any of the known sector designations from the camp, didn't correspond to a building number, didn't appear in clinic records or storage listings. It wasn't official. It wasn't public. It was something hidden, a location, a transfer, a decision made in silence. Outside, night had fallen gently over Marlow Creek, settling over the town like a velvet curtain lowered from above. Street lamps cast pale gold onto the pavement, their halos diffusing into soft blurs on the slick asphalt. And in the quiet back office of the police station, Clara remained at her desk, motionless, caught somewhere between the weight of what she now knew and the looming sense that she was standing on the very edge of something vast and dark, a ledge where the past, once still and buried, now threatened to rise and swallow the entire town unless spoken aloud, unless named. A knock came, soft, 3 short taps, not urgent but not hesitant either. Clara rose and opened the door. Ben Calloway stood there, his shoulders trembling, his coat wrinkled and damp with night dew, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in both hands like a fragile offering, as if he had been standing out there for quite some time before mustering the courage to come in. "I couldn't sleep," he said, voice hoarse, raw, like someone who had cried quietly in the dark. "I have to tell you, everything, right now." Clara led him into the small interrogation room, nothing inside but a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light that cast a cold white circle down onto the table's center, illuminating Ben's drawn face, exposing the deep shadows under his eyes, the new lines on the face of someone who, despite still being young, had aged in ways no one could see. Rex waited outside in the hallway, lying still, gaze fixed on the closed door, as though he understood that whatever was about to unfold inside needed absolute stillness to survive. Clara turned on the recorder. Then she sat. She didn't press, didn't interrupt. She just waited, the way one waits for a wound to open on its own. Ben began slowly, not because he didn't know the words, but because each sentence seemed to emerge from a place long buried, a scar torn open before it had ever truly healed. "That day," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "Eli told us he wanted out of the summer camp challenge Travis had come up with, said it was getting too intense, too far from what we'd agreed." Travis laughed, called him a coward. Then they argued. It didn't turn violent, but Travis pushed him. Ben paused. His eyes drifted somewhere else, not toward the past, but into it, like he was seeing it play out not behind his eyelids, but directly in front of him. "Eli fell, hit his head on a tree root. The blood, it came fast, too fast. I'd never seen anything like that. Travis panicked, screamed. I didn't know what to do. Dean just stood there, frozen, like he couldn't process it." "What happened next?" Clara asked, her voice steady, the only anchor in a sea of unraveling memory. Ben swallowed hard, knuckles tightening. "Travis said we couldn't call anyone. Said if people found out, his dad would lose everything. Said we'd be expelled, arrested. He made us drag Eli's body into the brush. He dug a hole. We helped. None of us could look at each other. No one spoke." "And the handkerchief?" Ben nodded, eyes filling. "It was Eli's. I kept it. I was going to give it to his mom, but I got scared. I wrapped it up and hid it under a tree. I thought, maybe if someone found it someday, Eli wouldn't be completely lost." Clara's eyes didn't leave the recorder's blinking light, pulsing like a heartbeat, a rhythm finally laid bare. "Travis said he'd take care of everything," Ben continued. "Then 3 days later, a man showed up, wore a suit, tall, spoke with an East Coast accent. He took me away, somewhere I can't even remember the name of. My mom, she just said everything had been taken care of. I never dared ask again." Clara turned off the recorder. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke, the silence settling between them like dust in a closed room untouched for years. Then, slowly and without a word, she rose from her chair, walked to the cabinet against the wall, and pulled out an old black-and-white photograph, summer camp 1989, yellowed around the edges, a ghost of a moment captured in time. She placed it gently on the table and pointed to a man standing beside a supply truck. "Is this him?" Ben leaned closer, eyes narrowing as they scanned the image. He gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. "That's him." Clara's eyes dropped to the caption beneath the photo. "William Grant, Guest of Honor, Opening Ceremony, Summer Camp 1989. Outside the window, rain began to fall, a soft, measured tapping, each drop hitting the pavement like the steady beat of a drum signaling the approach of a new chapter. Clara motioned for Ben to rest, then returned to her desk, unlocking the evidence file. The lighter, the keychain, the notebook, the blood-stained handkerchief, the confession. Once scattered fragments, now aligned, a river of truth converging on one name, one man. She turned to Rex, who had risen without her noticing, eyes fixed on the door, ears standing tall. From beyond the hallway came a barely audible sound, the whisper of tires over wet asphalt. Clara stepped to the window, gently pulling the curtain aside. A sleek black sedan had pulled into the lot, engine running. The driver didn't get out. The passenger didn't move. The window rolled down just a crack, just enough to reveal a partial profile, a sliver of a face, a pair of eyes gleaming cold and familiar, the same voice that had spoken to her the night before. Clara froze. She didn't need a name, didn't need a title. The timing, the positioning of the vehicle, the way those eyes pierced through glass and rain like a silent blade, not sharp enough to wound, but deep enough to press against the nerve that carries unspoken fear. They knew how close she was, and they didn't want her any closer. But Rex didn't blink. He stepped beside her, pressing lightly against her leg, nose lowered, ears twitching, as if he could smell something beyond the glass, something familiar yet off, something once trusted by men in power, but now sensed by a dog as the scent of danger. 2 a.m. No rain, but the air was thick with dampness, and a heavy fog blanketed Cedar Hollow like a shroud of sleep. Trees loomed tall and twisted in the haze, their silhouettes rippling like restless dreams. Clara and Rex moved through the western edge of the forest, a part never spoken of, a region on the map labeled only by a faded, almost erased symbol, like someone had tried to blot it out. Rex led the way, not rushing, not hesitating, each step placed with intention, each breath drawing in a memory left behind in the soil. It felt as though the forest itself was speaking to him, one layer of earth at a time. Clara could feel every muscle in her body pulled taut, like a wire stretched to its limit. She hadn't slept in over 40 hours. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears like a broken metronome. But in Rex's eyes that held no fear, only clarity, she found her anchor, her reason to keep walking deeper into what most had chosen to forget. And then Rex stopped. A small rise in the ground lay ahead, covered in moss, its shape too symmetrical to be natural, the earth there once disturbed long ago. Rex began to dig, not frantically but with focus, every clawed sweep like turning a page from a buried story. Clara knelt beside him, flashlight in hand, its beam cutting through damp earth until a glimpse of fabric appeared. The corner of an old backpack, frayed and torn, zipper half gone, the plastic of a once blue student ID cracked and faded. She reached in, hands trembling, and unzipped the bag. The scent hit her first. Mold, leather, and something old enough to make her throat tighten. Inside was so little, yet everything. A broken ballpoint pen, a nearly dissolved tin of peppermint mints, and a photo, a blurry color print of Eli between his parents, his arms around his mother's shoulders, his smile burning like sunlight, with his red bicycle, the one with the broken kickstand he'd loved, just visible behind them. Clara stared at the photo. Her chest caved inward. Her hand clenched around the edges like she was holding the last remaining fragment of a soul the world had tried to erase. A piece of Eli that hadn't vanished, only waited. She said nothing. Slipped the photo into a waterproof sleeve, then sat back on the forest floor, leaning against the trunk of a maple, her head bowed under the weight. Everything came crashing down in that moment. The truth she carried, the systems stacked against her, the cold eyes watching, the unseen hands pulling strings, the unrelenting responsibility to a boy whose body may be gone, but whose presence still lingered beneath these trees. "Clara!" The voice came from behind. She turned fast. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, wearing a long coat. The flashlight caught his face slowly, carving it from the night like a memory returning. Greg Mallory. Once her sharpest opponent, the man who had ordered her back when Rex broke formation, who stood for protocol and procedure, now stood in front of her, no longer with the gaze of control, but of a man who had seen too much and had begun to doubt everything he once believed. "I followed your GPS," he said, voice low, uncertain. "Saw your signal. I knew you weren't coming back. And I realized It's time I stop being the one who keeps quiet. Clara didn't answer. She simply held out the backpack, the photograph. Mallory took them both, his flashlight sweeping slowly across each item, his hand lingering longest on the image of Eli, whose joyful grin pierced through the gloom like sunlight bleeding into a cave. "They're covering it up," Mallory whispered. "And I'm starting to believe this boy wasn't just forgotten. He was pulled away, far from the place he was supposed to return to." A breeze passed through the forest, cool and light. Branches swayed gently, as if nodding in agreement, as if the woods themselves had been waiting for someone to finally say it aloud. Rex moved from where he had stood, his body turning eastward toward the thinning trees, as if the forest itself had opened a new chapter, and he, never one to pause at half-truths or settle for unfinished stories, was ready to lead once more. Clara stood, brushing her hands against the sides of her pants, then turned to look at Mallory. Not for thanks, not for reassurance, but with a single, firm nod that needed no translation. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken contract, a gesture that said from this moment forward, she would not walk this path alone. The following afternoon, Clara returned to the station. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained blanketed in a thin shroud of pale gray, a mourning veil that refused to lift. She hadn't even made it to her chair when a soft knock echoed through the glass frame at the far end of the hallway. And there, standing just beyond, was a familiar figure. Tall and lean, hair disheveled like the aftermath of too many sleepless nights, eyes full of spaces that had never quite healed. Dean Whitmore. He stood silently, waiting for her signal. And when Clara unlocked the door to the small meeting room at the end of the corridor, where light from a narrow window sliced across the tiled floor like a blade of truth, Dean stepped inside, set down his worn backpack beside the chair, and sat, hands clasped, unmoving. "There's something I've never told anyone," he began, voice low and hoarse, as though he were speaking not to Clara, but to something inside himself, a buried self, long silenced. "Not because I forgot, but because I wasn't allowed to remember." Clara sat opposite him, turned on the recorder, but kept her eyes fixed on his, not to pressure, not to push, but to offer a space, a promise. Here, there would be no more coercion, only choice, and maybe finally release. Dean inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of old wood, damp paper, and years of unspoken words, an atmosphere heavy with everything that had never been said, a room that could only be cleared by truth. "That day," he said, "Eli didn't fall. He was pushed. Travis shoved him, not to kill him, I think, but hard enough that Eli lost his balance. He hit his head on a rock. There was so much blood. Ben screamed. I stood there, frozen. I was so scared I couldn't move." "Did you try to get help?" Clara asked gently, not disrupting his flow, but holding the thread between his voice and the silence it had always fought. Dean shook his head, eyes already tinged with red. "I was just about to run, when my father appeared. He shouldn't have been there, but he was. He saw the blood. He saw Travis. And me. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't want to know. He just said, 'From now on, every version of this story is the same. No one says otherwise.'" Clara held her breath. Her heartbeat tapped like a warning inside her ribs. "He gave orders, literally. He ordered me to forget. Said it was the only way to keep me safe, to keep our family name from being dragged through the mud." "No one blames a kid's game," he said, like it was a minor mistake, not a life lost. "Your father is," Clara asked, though the answer had already settled itself in her mind. Dean nodded, his gaze fixed on the stripe of light stretching across the floor. "He was William Grant's senior aide. They co-managed the Forest Land Investment Trust. the one that bought up nearly 200 acres surrounding the camp. If word of a death had come out, everything would have collapsed. The room fell into silence. Only the low mechanical hum of the HVAC unit remained. And then, with hands that trembled slightly, Dean unzipped his backpack, pulling out a folded piece of paper, old, worn soft at the creases. "I found this after. It was a letter Eli wrote to his mom. He never got to send it. I've kept it hidden for 10 years. He placed it on the table. Clara opened it, careful with its fragile edges. "Dear Mom, I miss you. I wish it didn't rain today so I could ride my bike like always. I'm okay here. But I don't like Travis. He pushes people and never says sorry. Ben is kind, Dean is quiet. I feel a little lonely. But tomorrow I'll tell you a secret. There's some grown-up who keeps following us." Clara looked up, her skin crawling at the faded line, not knowing whether it was the invention of a child's imagination or the chilling echo of something real, something no one had wanted to believe. "Some grown-up who keeps following us." Dean closed his eyes, his shoulders trembling under the weight of memory. "I left town 3 days after that. Told no one. I just couldn't walk past Eli's house again. Couldn't see his mom standing on the porch, staring out into the woods." Clara stood slowly, moved around the table, and placed a hand gently on Dean's shoulder. Not as an officer coaxing a statement, but as someone pulling another out from the quicksand of guilt. "Dean," she said softly, "you can stop here, or you can give Eli his voice back, through yours." He looked up at her, eyes glassy but steadier, clearer. He nodded, not with hesitation, but with resolve. "I'm ready. I'll sign. I'll speak. In court, to the press, to anyone. I'll tell everything." When Dean left the station that evening, the sky had begun its slow descent into dusk. The moon had not yet risen, but the first stars were starting to pierce the silvered veil above. Clara stood in the doorway, watching as his figure disappeared down the row of street lamps, then turned back inside. In her hand was Eli's letter, the childish handwriting jagged, uneven, but unmistakably pure, the voice of a boy who had never gotten to grow up, now finally heard. Rex lay by the table, his body still. But when Clara knelt beside him, he raised his head, eyes meeting hers, no question in them, just a quiet certainty, as if to say, "We're still on the right path." Clara turned to her desk, activated the recording. Dean's statement played in the stillness, his voice breaking but firm, echoing into the corners of the room. But just as she reached to stop the device, a new sound interrupted the silence, a sharp electronic chirp. "Beep, third match confirmed, number 27. A connection verified." A data string emerged, quiet, mechanical, as if awakened by Dean's truth, as if something buried in the digital silence had begun to unlock. Her screen shifted, the interface melting into motion, a blinking green schematic replacing the static file display. And then it appeared, a web of tangled coordinates, lines threading across a digital map like veins, and at the center, circled in red, a single pinpoint, the exact location east of the campgrounds, marked for years as a temporarily decommissioned ranger zone. Beneath it, the faint outline of a sealed tunnel, closed since 1990. A tunnel leading directly beneath shelter number 3. Clara rose to her feet, her body tingling with an electric urgency that coursed through her veins not as pain, but as a raw, living current, something that told her with unmistakable clarity that this moment mattered, that what she was about to do could change everything. Her hand reached for the phone, ready to call Keller, and then the office door opened. Greg Mallory stepped in first, his face carved from something heavier than routine. Behind him were 2 strangers, a man and a woman, both in dark suits, both wearing ID badges without agency insignias. They didn't wait to be invited. They walked in like the room had been theirs all along. "Clara Monroe," the woman said flatly, her voice as dry and cold as a government memo read aloud without emotion. "You are hereby suspended from the investigation on grounds of procedural violations and unauthorized access to classified data." Clara turned to Mallory, expecting resistance, hoping for it, but he only gave the smallest nod, barely a movement, the kind made by someone who had been cornered into compliance or had made a choice to sacrifice something greater than his own position. "You have the right to remain silent," the man added, voice mechanical and devoid of sympathy. "All materials related to this case, including recordings and physical evidence, will be collected and sealed pending internal review." Clara didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply pulled the memory card from the recorder, set it quietly on the desk, and looked directly at Mallory, not with accusation, but with a question. "Are you still with me? Or have you already stepped behind the safety of your title?" That afternoon, the Marlow Creek Police Department was surrounded by press vans and satellite trucks. Antennas stretched skyward like warning spires, camera tripods filled the sidewalk, and foam-covered microphones jutted forward like weapons ready to seize a name. That name, inevitably, was Clara Monroe. The evening news ran a spliced, dramatized segment, blurry footage of her and Rex walking into the eastern forest, layered beneath a sensational headline, "Female Officer Invades Restricted Zone, Witch Hunt or Truth Suppressed." Behind the screen, no one saw the hand of William Grant, the man who never appeared in public but whose influence could tilt the axis of a media narrative overnight, reshaping facts into suspicion and turning a search for truth into an act of defiance against protocol. Meanwhile, Rex had been taken to a training facility for behavioral evaluation. Clara was barred from seeing him, despite every entry in the case file pointing to him as the key to every major discovery. Silence wrapped itself around her like fog. No calls, no replies, no one daring to say her name more than twice a day. Clara now sat alone in the small room she'd rented above the old bookstore, where the light from a street lamp filtered through sheer curtains and splattered faint patterns across the walls, uneven, fragmented, like her thoughts, not chaotic but weighted, as if the night sky itself had settled against her chest and refused to lift. She turned on the radio, a habit from a quieter time, and as if fate were mocking her, the local news crackled to life. The investigation into the death of teenager Eli Barrett has taken another turn, as the lead officer has been suspended for failing to adhere to official criminal procedure standards. Clara shut it off. She didn't feel anger anymore, only a dull, persistent ache behind the sternum, as though pieces of her were being scattered by wind, as though Eli's memory was once again being smothered, this time not by soil, but by words coated in civility and laced with intention. Then, just as the silence returned, there came a soft click from beneath the door. A thin envelope slid through the narrow gap. Clara crossed the room, bent down, and picked it up. No sender. Just the envelope and a folded note inside, written in faint pencil. "Coordinates 27A second hatch. The guard's been changed. They don't know you know." Tucked behind the note, a satellite photo, a segment of the eastern forest with a small circle marked, and on the back, neatly printed as if transcribed from a classified file, "The bedrock has cracked. All it needs now is one more footprint." Clara folded the paper, slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat. She didn't call anyone. She didn't leave a message. And when she stepped out of her room into the dark street, the pre-dawn sky hung low and pale yellow, streetlights flickering like dying fireflies, the air colder than it should have been, as if the morning itself were testing the resolve of a woman prepared to stand against the system that once carried her badge. At the far edge of Cedar Hollow's eastern trail, Rex was already there. He sat tall, ears perked, nose lifted like a biological antenna, catching signals that no machine ever could. Signals not from above, but from within the earth itself. Clara didn't call him. She didn't have to. She placed her hand gently on his head, and in his eyes she saw it clear as day. We're closer than ever. The old eastern path was no longer open. Makeshift barricades, striped tape and wooden signs marked the main trails, but Rex led her instead along the side of the ravine, where water had once run, and now left only mossy stones and slick gravel in its place. They passed the stone flats where trees thinned, and early morning light began to bleed through. Faint as breath, but enough to guide their way. Near the midpoint of a low hillside, precisely where the satellite map had marked, Rex came to a halt. He stretched forward, nose to stone, then turned to Clara and growled, low and soft, not a warning but a summons, a signal. It's time. A large slab of rock leaned awkwardly against the hill, and beneath it, a narrow gap, just wide enough for a grown person to crawl through. Moss clung to the stone surface, but there were fractures, sharp and fresh, the kind that only come from recent movement. As if someone had been here, or something had come out. Clara bent down, flashlight in hand, the beam slicing across the slick, moss-streaked stone walls, illuminating the narrow interior of the cave where time had thickened into silence and the air carried that unmistakable scent of moisture trapped for decades, of decayed earth and sleeping moss. And there, beneath a fine layer of dust and stone debris, something emerged. A scrap of fabric, deep green, with faint white stripes, the very pattern of the jacket Eli had been wearing in the final photograph. Her heart clenched, not in fear, but in that aching, quiet recognition that only comes when memory collides with evidence. She stepped further in, slowly, cautiously, each footfall heavy with the weight of years, as though she were walking not on stone, but across the fragile pages of a diary no one had dared open. Rex didn't lead, not this time. Instead, he remained beside her, shoulder to shoulder, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, not in hesitation, but in solidarity, as if he too understood that this was not just a place, but a confession carved into earth and stone. Beside the jacket, a dark smear stained the rock. Dried blood, long since turned to rust, but still clinging to the surface like something that refused to be forgotten. Its shape was irregular, trailing in a wide, curving arc. Not a spill, but a trace. The kind left when a body is dragged. The kind that whispers of something being hidden rather than mourned. Clara opened the evidence kit with practiced hands and extracted a swab, her fingers steady even as her breath caught in her chest. When the beam of light hit the stain directly, a faint fluorescence flickered in response, pale, unmistakable, the chemical reaction confirming what instinct already knew, a perfect match to the blood sample previously confirmed as Eli's. There was no room left for doubt, no more allowances for interpretation, no more exits from what had now become a truth carved into stone. She stepped out of the cave, her knees giving way as she sat down heavily on a flat rock at the entrance, the weight of what she had found pressing into her bones. Rex lay beside her, calm and alert, his breathing slow but purposeful, eyes still fixed on the mouth of the cave like a sentinel standing guard over the truth, just unearthed. Clara pulled out her phone, activated the secure transmission device, and began uploading everything. Photographs, fluorescence results, GPS coordinates, sending it all to the hidden server Keller had once configured for cases too sensitive for the public grid. Each packet of data flew silently through encrypted airwaves, piercing the armor of institutional denial like silent arrows too precise to deflect. By noon, she was back in town. But she didn't go to the station. She didn't go home. She sat in a small cafe near the library, a quiet corner table facing the square, where the memorial to the town's missing stood like a scar carved in stone, bearing Eli Barrett's name in small letters between dozens of others. Yet to Clara, at that moment, it was the only name that glowed. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Good. You found it. But there's one place left. The bottom level. Number 27A. Don't go alone." Clara looked at Rex. He had just finished a biscuit offered by one of the cafe staff, his tongue darting out to clean the last crumbs from his muzzle. His eyes blinked slowly, not tense, not troubled, but with the calm readiness of a being who had long since accepted his role between light and shadow, always prepared to return, no matter how dark the last descent had been. Clara opened her notebook and drew a dark line beneath the old scribble. Number 27A. And for the first time since this began, a small smile broke across her face. Not because the mystery had unraveled entirely, but because she now understood that the final proof wasn't just the scrap of fabric found in the stone. It was still waiting, sealed behind a door no one had dared to open, a door behind which truth had grown too large to be hidden any longer. The trial began on a morning colder and quieter than usual in Marlow Creek. Outside the district courthouse, a line had formed along the old stone steps, sunlight breaking through the tall windows and casting fractured light across the Statue of Justice, its bronze scales slightly tilted, an eerie, fitting metaphor for a story this town had buried beneath 30 years of silence. Clara sat in the third row, just behind Judith. Rex, granted special attendance, wore the honorary unit insignia on his collar and lay quietly at Clara's feet, not asleep, not restless, simply alert, as if still tracking the scent of a truth he had helped bring to the surface, his eyes never leaving the witness stand, waiting for the next voice to rise and carry Eli's name forward. Travis Grant stood at the defense table, flanked by 2 attorneys, his gray suit impeccable, hair neatly combed, but his eyes, once sharp with confidence, once buffered by wealth, legacy, and silence, were hollow. The camera flashes from the press popped like dry twigs, but he no longer flinched or turned. The mask had cracked. He was no longer the golden boy shielded by privilege, no longer the ambitious young executive bathed in press praise. He was a defendant, named in a growing list of charges: involuntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, concealment of a body, political interference. Clara listened as the charges were read aloud, each phrase cold, precise, sterile in tone, but burning with memory. With every syllable she recalled the journey: the cave, the jacket, the handkerchief, the child's letter, the hesitant voices that had finally chosen to speak. Then Judith stepped up to the stand. She wore deep violet, a color of mourning that had outlasted seasons but refused to fade. Her hair was nearly all silver now, but her spine remained unbowed, like the day she had walked 2 hours door to door, holding out her son's photograph, with eyes too proud to beg, but too broken to stop. She stood with no tears. But when she spoke, her voice was wind breaking free from a 10-year stillness. "For 10 years I sat on my porch every evening, hoping some stranger would pull up and tell me they'd seen Eli on the road. For 10 years I asked myself, did my son suffer? Was he scared? Did someone hold his hand when the end came?" She paused, long enough for silence to fill the room like rising water. Then she turned, not just to Clara, but also to Rex, whose ears had lifted, eyes fixed on her like he understood what was coming. "The answer is yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "My son was found by a heart that never gave up, by someone who chose not to stay quiet, and by a creature who has never known how to lie. They gave Eli his voice back, and they gave a mother her truth." No one clapped, no one moved. The moment was too sacred for sound. But something had changed, in the stillness, in the air. The way people looked at Clara now was different, No longer with suspicion, no longer as if she were a disruption to be tolerated, but as if they, too, had just awakened from a long, quiet sleep built from lies. The judge postponed the formal sentencing by 3 days to finalize supporting documentation. But by the time the courtroom emptied, the headlines had already begun to shift. No longer officer breaks protocol in decade-old case. Now they read, "The woman who woke a sleeping town." Names once buried were being spoken aloud. Walls once protected by legacy and law were beginning to crack. And through it all, Clara sat still, a single letter in her coat pocket, a dog by her side, and the unshakable certainty that the truth, once spoken, never goes back to sleep. That afternoon, Clara returned to the old precinct. The room had been cleaned, the furniture rearranged, the air touched by unfamiliar order. Yet when she opened the door, with a single gentle motion of her wrist, it still welcomed her the same way it once did. The scent of paper, of aged wood, of quiet beginnings, the faint perfume of the earliest days when she first entered the force, all of it rose like a memory that hadn't faded but waited, intact, just beneath the surface. Mallory followed her in, holding a small cardboard box in both hands. "They returned it," he said simply. "All the case files. Your suspension's been lifted. And Rex—" His eyes dropped to where the dog stood by his side, tail swaying faintly. "He's about to be awarded the Medal of Honor." Clara didn't speak right away. She sank into the chair behind her old desk, reached into her coat, and pulled out a freshly restored photograph. Eli smiling beneath a shaft of sunlight, the image salvaged from the blurred photo found in his backpack, and sharpened with care. She pinned it to the center of the caseboard, not as a closing note, but as a symbol of perseverance, of something that refused to be erased. Rex leapt onto the chair beside her, resting his chin on her lap. Clara bowed her head, her fingers moving softly through his fur. And then, in a whisper meant only for herself, she spoke. "We're not stopping here. There's still one more door, isn't there?" And the moment her words fell into silence, the phone tucked away in her coat gave a single, muted vibration. Just one. As if an answer had arrived from the other side of the dark. A confirmation that somewhere beneath the story already told, there was still a deeper basement, still a room not listed in any record, still a secret Eli had never lived long enough to name. 3 days later, under the trembling golden canopy of Cedar Hollow, the memorial took place. Not in a church, not beneath a dome, but right in the forest where the journey had begun, and where Eli had finally been found, not as a body, but as a mosaic of memory, pieced together through patience and light by those who refused to turn away. The wind came from the north, carrying with it the scent of wild grass and damp wood, a quiet fragrance that brushed across hair, shoulders, and the gazes of everyone who had gathered. They stood in a circle around an oakwood memorial, Eli Barrett's name hand-carved into the surface, each letter deep, not for grandeur, but for permanence. No one spoke from the podium. Instead, they let Judith step forward, her hands clutching a clean, folded jacket wrapped in white cloth, the one they'd found in the woods, the one that once warmed her boy. She said little. She placed it gently upon the stone, where sunlight pierced through the canopy and fell like grace, and whispered, "You won't lose your way again." Clara stood at the edge of the circle, her hand resting softly on Rex's head, not as an officer holding a leash, but as someone standing beside a soul who had guided her, not with orders or logic, but with breath, with heart, with an instinct that knew how to lead without ever needing words. The mayor came forward last, carrying a small wooden plaque engraved with the imprint of a dog's paw. Beneath it, the inscription read, "In honor of Rex, a guide who needed no orders, no medal, only a heart loyal enough never to turn back." Applause broke out, not loud, not staged, but gentle, scattered, like the slow heartbeat of a crowd who knew that the greatest acts of devotion often arrive without fanfare. Rex didn't bark, didn't move. He stood still, head tilted just slightly, eyes fixed on the shaft of sunlight breaking through the leaves, as if he could hear someone calling, not in sound, but in presence. Clara knew then, without doubt, Eli was near. The ceremony ended as the sun reached the rim of the canopy. People dispersed in quiet clusters, walking the forest trail in soft murmurs, their footsteps merging with the rustling of dry leaves like a final autumn chorus. Only Clara and Rex remained, standing at the edge of a narrow trail untouched, the path leading deeper into the forest, into the place the maps no longer showed, but memory still remembered. Clara didn't turn back. She leaned down instead, took the frayed gray leash in hand, fastened it with care, not like a handler preparing for duty, but like someone tying a knot around resolve, and walked forward. No words, no commands. And just as before, Rex followed without hesitation, not too fast, not too slow, just enough to match the rhythm of someone who refused to let go. Light spilled through the trees ahead like a ribbon of silk, unfurling across the damp ground, leading them onward into the place that had once been only darkness. Clara didn't know the exact destination, but she knew with certainty. Every step they took now would become the first line in a new chapter, perhaps longer, perhaps harder, but one that must be told. And when they reached the last bend in the path, where the forest widened into a moss-covered basin, Rex stopped. He lifted his head and pointed his nose toward a lone, upright stone slab rooted deep in the earth. Its face was rough, weathered, scarred, but there in the center, barely clinging to the stone through years